The pledge. Ladies, you could always do it simultaneously.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, there's no revision to the agenda order that I know of, and so instead of a student participation, we're going to have superintendent participation to begin.
It's so nice to have all these media microphones for Teacher of the Year finalists. That's great. And well-deserved. So, the Teacher of the Year, every year at this meeting in May, we announce a finalist. Teacher of the Year process is rigorous and begins with nominations from other teachers. Nominees then must submit a resume, essays, and recommendations. Finalists then have a lesson videotaped, and the final three are formally interviewed by the Teacher of the Year committee. The finalist, West Hartford's Teacher of the Year, will be announced on May 31st, 2018. The 2018 Teacher of the Year finalists, that we're announcing publicly tonight, are Michelle Lacroix, Rebecca Saraceno, and Sonia Stemmer. So I have a plaque for each in recognition from West Hartford, and I'll go through each one, and this is, because this is when people start looking for clues, this is purely alphabetical, how we go through this. But let me just say that it's, this past year, Luis is in back, our Teacher of the Year this past year, who has represented West Hartford so well, and this group, I know, would do the same if any of them were selected. And talking to people that know them more closely over the past few days, it was inspiring, really. And I thank you as a West Hartford parent for giving all that you do to our kids. So I'm going to start with Michelle Lacroix. Michelle started in West Hartford in August of 2008. There's Michelle. She's been a special education teacher at Whiting Lane and at Norfelt, and previously taught in Massachusetts. Michelle, this past year, was the 2017 grant coordinator for We All Have a Story to Tell, Inspiring Equity Through Community Conversations, the exhibit that we still see up in Town Hall and that many people came to. This fostered cultural competence among educators in the community through community organizing and establishing organic community conversations. And I can tell you what Michelle did this summer, because she did it with me, is spent time speaking to all these community members and hearing their stories. And I don't know how you got me to be so honest with you, but apparently she did that with everybody. But she just has a way with people that make them want to be honest. With her in her position, certainly helps, because kids love her and trust her. And I know that from all of them that I deal with. She also is a valuable member of the community, president of Friends of Conard Hockey, WHEA executive board member, chair of the Ethnic Affairs Committee of the West Hartford Public Schools Equity and Diversity Council. So please join me in congratulating Michelle Tremblay-Lacroix. Okay. Rebecca Saraceno from Smith. Smith's beginning to have a stranglehold on this award, or at least on its nominees. It's very special because Rebecca is at Smith STEM School, and she's the vocal music teacher at Smith STEM School, which shows the marriage of the arts and STEM, which we so believe in here, and which Smith STEM School lives up to every day. Rebecca has been a teacher in West Hartford since 2001 at Smith STEM School the whole time. Previously, she taught in Wethersfield and also has been a private piano instructor. I mentioned the connection between the arts and science, technology, engineering, and math. And Rebecca doesn't just do that in her work. She's also a presenter, state and national level. She's presented at the Connecticut STEM Conference, STEM plus Music equals a match made in an integrated classroom. And then last year at the National Science Teachers Association National Conference on Science Education in Los Angeles, she was chosen to present on STEM plus music, a match made in an integrated classroom. So she is nationally recognized for her work in not just educating the mind, but the soul, as we know music does. She's director of Smith Choir, which takes part in many events during the year. In fact, this Sunday will be at the Yard Goats game. Michaela, I assume you'll be there. I know your affinity. And then, in partnership with the Smith PTO, this is just my favorite little thing that she does. That's not a little thing at all, because it shows community, is that she helps to organize the annual Cocoa and Caroling in December in the neighborhood at Smith, and brings kids throughout the neighborhood stopping and singing as she goes around. So thank you so much from all of us in West Hartford Public Schools, not just for your teaching, but for who you are for our kids. Rebecca Saraceno. Okay. And last, alphabetically, I might remind you again, Sonia Stemmer started here in August of 2012. Sonia is a language arts teacher and a team leader at Sedgwick. In her time as a teacher, previously, not just in West Hartford, but also in Bristol and in Waterbury, you'll notice that her extensive classroom experiences aren't just in English. She's also taught theater. She's also been in alternative education programs, both here and outside. She's also taught adult education classrooms, special education, and regular education. You see, Sonia is in every way, shape, and form a teacher. And actually, her application to West Hartford Public Schools, the first sentence, which was like one of my favorite first sentences I've ever seen, was, "I consider it a privilege to be a teacher," when in fact, we're the ones privileged to have her here. And she's passionate about literature and bring that literature to life for students. People describe this great English teacher that makes people want to love the subject matter and want to get in depth in what they're reading. But more importantly, she is described by somebody in her building as the special thing about Sonia is she connects with kids who don't typically connect with school. And not only does she do that as part of her practice, she seeks those kids out and wants them to be on her team and wants them to be in her class. She's an inspiration to all of us. We are lucky to have her. And in her time in West Hartford, which hasn't been long, in 6 years now, she has made quite a reputation for herself. Congratulations, Sonia Stemmer.
Thank you so much. And now we have public comment. I invite David Hubbard to join us. Just stand right up there. Tell us your address, even though we have it down here, a second time, and speak to the multiple microphones that will be in front of you.
My name is David Hubbard, and my address is 1 Glendale Road, West Hartford, Connecticut. Congratulations to the three of you. I didn't realize I would be speaking so quickly. I thought the turnout might be a little bit larger than this. But I'm not here for or against the time schedules, but I just wanted to throw some little things out there just for people to kind of think of. We might very well be the first town that's doing this. What the outcomes might be in regards to sports, especially fall sports, especially the cross-country teams. They have to start after they make it to their locations. A lot of times, the last group of either boys or girls that run are running, and it's getting towards dusk. So if we end the school a little bit later, they might be running in the dark. If we're running on roads, it's a slight concern I think that we should have, something to be thinking about. If we're going to go to a later time, kids are obviously going to be getting home later. If they're getting home later, homework gets started later, they're going to bed later. they're going to end up sleeping in later. Obviously, by starting later, it doesn't really change things. They're still getting the same amount of time. But if this is for some reason an idea because kids are frequently late to school or absent a lot, and we're thinking that this might be some type of way to help those kids out, I guess the question would be, will it in the long run help those kids out? Storms, winter storms. Obviously, we've had a lot of snow days. If we start a little bit later, what will happen with choosing and making that decision for an early closing? Or are we all of a sudden, because we're starting a little bit later, now going to have to cancel school because we're not going to get the right amount of hours in during the day? Something to think about. If we're starting later, there's a lot of working parents. Are we going to have enough daycare facilities available for all of the kids who may need to go into daycare at one of the elementary schools? I know that Brayburn, where my daughter goes to school, they are maxed out, and the state will not allow any more kids into that daycare. So something to kind of think about. So again, I haven't heard anything tonight. I'm not for or against it. I'm just hoping that everything is kind of out there, and we've kind of thought it all out. I think my biggest concern on this is that if West Hartford's the first and only to do this, it would primarily just be the sports and possibly the overtime that might occur because of the sports. And obviously, when we're looking at budget issues, I'd hate to see overtime for custodians and security and then have to cut staff in our buildings that work with the kids on a daily basis and give them the education. So, I wish you luck on your decisions, and, again, congratulations.
Thank you. Anyone else who didn't sign up but is still welcome to speak? Okay. Thank you. We have no unfinished business, and so we're going to move to new business and an extremely long motion about the healthy food certification. So I'm going to summarize this for everybody. I would like a motion that we, first of all, certify that all the food items meet the nutrition standards. Second of all, that all of the food items that don't meet those nutrition standards only happen at specific events at specific times, not from vending machines, etc. And the same with beverages that are not healthy. So that's the general motion. If I could have a motion in a second.
So moved. Second.
Are you here to present or just to answer questions if we have them?
Answer questions.
Questions or discussion? Oh,
I just, I've talked about this in the past. This is just something that we just have to pass along to follow nutrition levels. I just remind everybody, and that's all I'm doing, is that our lunch program has suffered because of this particular recommendation or pursuant to this section by the state and federal. It has suffered quite a bit to the fact where, we no longer are even solvent as far as making money in the lunch program. So I just want to remind people that that's not necessarily the greatest thing for our kids, but here it is. So.
Sorry, just a couple things. One is most of the nutrition standards are set by the federal government, and we need that to get the major
Federal funds, I get it.
the federal funds, which is about $1 million.
Right.
This is a modest adjunct to those things, and for which we get additional 10 cents a meal, around $70,000, and we've been doing it since 2007.
right, but I think the point is, while it's healthier for kids and while it's federal, it doesn't change the fact that it certainly hurts our bottom line, right? Which is...
This particular thing does not hurt our bottom line. No, this doesn't. This actually is a benefit to our bottom line because they're not significantly more onerous than the federal requirements, and we get 10 cents a meal or $70,000. So this particular one is a benefit.
All right, so I'll restate. It's the lunch program in general.
That's right. We have all kinds of issues about the lunch program losing money, but this is not part of it. I understand. Okay. Other questions or comments? We ready to vote? Okay. All in favor of this motion to meet the standards except in specific ways at specific times? Please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. Thank you, sir. Moving right along to the superintendent's report.
Moving quick tonight. All right, so one, just for informational purposes, we know that the town council further reduced the budget by $200,000. What typically happens during this process is that there would be a motion made at the next meeting, and you would amend the budget by the $200,000 at that point. The reason for the time in between is for my staff communicate with any programs or people that would be affected, communicate with you about the motion that you want introduced, but so that would be at the May 15th Board of Education meeting. Good news. There's a lot of good news stories tonight, and really, this is the time of year where it's hard. It's May 1st, so our kids have committed to where they're going, those that are moving on to school, including these two. Congratulations, and we know it's a load off of people's minds, including our parents. And in addition to that, we tend to get different recognition at this time of year. And I've just been informed by the National Association of Music Merchants that once again West Hartford has been named as a 2018 Best Communities for Music Education winner, one of 538 communities in the country. This is a testament to our music and performing arts program, which, as we know, our community takes very seriously, as represented tonight, even with our Teacher of the Year. So just a great recognition for West Hartford. TSA competition. It was actually hosted in West Hartford this weekend, which this, I'll give you the rundown of the different events. Students from Concord and King Philip entered, and there were teams from all over New England, hosted in West Hartford, Rhode Island, New York, Massachusetts, all had competition here. So here's our Concord students who did exceptionally well. And you'll get the gist of the conference when I go through what the awards were. First place, architectural design, Chloe Tutane, first place in New England. First place in coding in New England, Isabella Nachev. First place in coding, tie, different divisions, Maya Flores by a team, Maya Flores, Rachel Hennessy, and Shannon Tron. First place in the state, second place in New England, music production, Max Mega, Tom Hosek, Julian Flores. First place in the state, second place in New England, on-demand video, Maya Flores, Shannon Trong, Rachel Hennessy, Summer Calvert, and Jamie Kurowski. First place in the state, second place in New England, video game design, Ben Ratchford, Jackson O'Sullivan, Dylan Wu, Charlie Hosek, Jamie Kurowski. First place in state, second place in New England, coding, Chris Nguyen, Lindy Quach. Second place, extemporaneous speech, Trevor Ratchford. And third place in the Tech Bowl team, Dylan Wu, Jamie Kurowski, and Connor Baldwin. From King Philip, second place New England, video game design, Jonathan Pincus. Second place in the Tech Bowl team, Alex Steinberg, Avi Jacobs, Omar Badi. Third place, flight endurance, Ahmad Mahmood. And third place, Vex IQ Robotics, Omar Bhatt. So I think it's really cool that we see both our arts and our STEM programs recognized at the same time in our schools. So well done to them. Now our language program. Congratulations are in order for Sophia Cornicello, an 8th grade French student at King Philip in Nancy Barlow's class. Sophia is a platinum winner on Le Grand Concours, the national French contest. This means she earned the top score in the nation in her level division. She will receive a platinum medal and a plaque, as well as Nancy receiving a plaque as her teacher, who did such a good job. So congratulations to Nancy, to Sophia, and to the King Philip community and our World Language Department. So, with that being said, good news.
Wow, the Grand Concours. The fact that my mother grew up on the Grand Concours, does that get her anything? No, just asking. Wow, that's really impressive. Congratulations to everybody. That's really remarkable. Thank you. Okay, now the moment everyone's been waiting for, Rethinking School Start Times Committee Update with Ms. Ann McCrinnan and Mr. Paul Vicinis. And I just want to say that Ann in particular has been unbelievable, just nonstop effort. We have been nagging her from the beginning to the end, and she's just done a remarkable job. So this, just to be clear, is the last formal piece, but we still have the evaluations and the comments and things to come. So this is not the last meeting on the subject.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for those kind comments. Happy to be here again with you tonight, and we have Mr. Chipboard with us who will help out with some of the transportation numbers as he knows them so much better than anyone else. Thank you. Mr. Vicinis is here to help us with all things West Hartford. So tonight we are back with you for our third update. I hope informational to give you little bits of this at a time, give you time to digest all of the details of possibly changing school start time. Tonight, we will focus our work in certain areas, transportation, the stakeholder impact work, the Town of West Hartford impact work, professional learning, and the board asked specifically for some more background on social and emotional implications. I do want to kind of bring us back in time. We started in December. And our purpose is to research the challenges and the benefits of changing school start times. And of course, this work is predicated on, or your request, I believe, is predicated on the research from the Center for Disease Control, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and many, many, many others who have advocated for later school start time. So we always want to remind you that was our purpose, and we will see some challenges tonight as we did on other nights, but we are grounded in the fact that this request is based on that. So as we start tonight, we will start with the transportation piece. We remind you we had subcommittees for all of this work, so I want to formally thank the committee members who came to many meetings, went off on their own, researched, came back, and contributed to the report. So in terms of our in terms of our transportation subcommittee, we had on this committee Mr. Andrew Clapsaddle, is principal of Sedgwick Middle School, Mr. Peter Pfeffer, a Sedgwick teacher actually, and Mrs. Jennifer Boyd, a high school parent. And they did a very nice job of working with the transportation department to get us some information and share it with you. I do want to always say that if we went forward with something, there'd be more detail needed. There would be more investigation needed. And when there were ever times identified, we could really dig in. So this is digging in without specific times. So we looked at our current three-tiered transportation system. We looked at the private transportation to private schools that we are responsible for. We looked at, there had been some discussion of, well, what if we did a two-tiered system? It's like Newtown went from 3 to 2, and I had heard that comment. So we looked at that. And then there are just some other considerations that you may want to be aware of. To remind you, our current transportation system looks, I hope this chart is somewhat legible to you, but we start in the mornings with our high schools and our private high schools, starting around 6:45 and delivering students to their high schools with the number of buses you see, both small and large. School day ends and those routes go home. Those same buses then rotate into the middle school. So it's not new buses, it's those plus a few more rotate into the middle school run that is beginning to pick up children around 6:55, 7:05, delivering those students for an 8 o'clock start time in both private and public middle schools. We have 9 overall private schools in town. With those number of buses. And then those same buses are used again to do the elementary run. So you can imagine these buses cycling through 3 runs. And as you go into the elementaries, there are a few more needed each time. But for the most part, these are. So the good news about this is one of the things we found is that, sorry, didn't advance. Thank you. We would likely need minor changes to our routes if we change the order of these buses, because they would be coming out of different locations and starting in different places. But is not believed it would be major restructuring. It just would be, you'd be coming from a different starting point, and you'd have to change those routes. One of the concerns we did come up across is there are 17 shared buses with the private schools. And my understanding is that we transport West Hartford resident children to West Hartford private schools. So we are not responsible for transporting our West Hartford resident students who would go to maybe Westminster School or something in Simsbury or Avon, but we are responsible for transporting them to the private schools.
If I could jump in here, and I'll ask Chip to jump in. This is almost the interregnum piece, because it's something people don't always understand, and I defer to Chip because he's been doing it a long time. But it is it's state statute that anybody living in West Hartford, we have to transport to a private school in West Hartford. This is the same in any town. If the issue is in West Hartford, we have far more private schools than basically any other town, around here certainly. But we have to spend commensurate with actually, go ahead, Chip, at this point. Because I get this number mixed up.
So, anyway, currently we operate as one unified school system for transportation. In other words, we transportate all West Hartford residents to all West Hartford located schools, whether they're public or private. So we try and minimize the total cost of the system to both the board and the town. So when there are 5 buses that are solely dedicated to private school students, and so those are charged 100% to the town, and there's 17 buses that do either 1 or 2 runs for the public schools and then 1 run for the private, or 2 runs for the private and then 1 for the public, that we just split 50-50. So it's just really an allocation of cost. But the goal is there is this overall cost for operating the system. And so the private schools would obviously, when we talk about what the impact of shifting the starting times are, if all the private schools shift their starting times, so their high schools will start at whatever you decide our high schools start at, and the other schools start at the same time, then there would be no impact, because presumably everything would just sort of rotate around. With some minor caveats, because we're going whatever we end up deciding, it's not going to be high school, middle school, elementary. So there may be some minor route changes or something like that. So we haven't done that full analysis till we get a more specific plan. But if the private schools all of a sudden say, hey, well, we don't want to change our starting time, we've been doing it this way, so we're just going to keep doing it the way we're going to do it, we may not be able to share all those same buses. So as indicated in this thing, the worst case scenario is all 17 of those shared buses become 17 public, instead of 17 shared buses, it becomes 17 public buses and 17 private buses. So it's an additional cost of 17 buses. And it would be split roughly half and half between the town and the board, the way that would work. We don't have we don't have the full answer right now, but that's just the impact that could occur as we change the start time and other places do or do not follow with us. And again, it would depend on a full detailed route analysis, because again, we look at it as a whole system and then allocate the cost based on where the buses are going.
So the interesting point that we didn't necessarily recognize in the writing of the report is because the private schools themselves don't pay for any of the buses, that impetus for them, that motivation for them to follow along isn't necessarily there.
Oh, yes, of course.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the state statute enough to already know this answer, but I assume you guys are. Are we required to transport the West Hartford students to any West Hartford private school regardless of that school's start time? So even if it doesn't align well with our own start time?
Correct.
So we do, I know KO starts late once a week, and we accommodate that and transport people there?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So we already have certain buses, and to the extent that we can then use one bus for two different schools, that is a cost. So again, we try and in other words, whatever the parameters are, these are the start times, these are the location, these are where the kids are, we try and minimize the costs. And the other thing to be aware of is the state statute also does allow us to allows the town to limit their cost to twice the average per pupil expense. And the town experimented with that 3 years ago. No, was it? No, 3 or 4 years. Whenever it was it really 8 years ago?
It was, I think it was during the.
I'm too old then.
I know. Yeah, so that's the kind of unique feature here, is that this is, just to make people understand, we know West Hartford's budget is all West Hartford's budget, but for purposes, there's a Board of Ed budget and a town budget. Private busing comes out of the town budget. And so their decision on how much to transport is a town issue, not our issue. So.
Well, no, they still have to. They
have to. It's
they
the
have
amount.
to transport,
Yes.
but there are limits in terms of what they can do. So, in other words, what the double cost is, which would mean, I think at the time it was like, okay, we'll transfer you for the first 100 days of the year, and you guys have to pay the other 80. Was sort of what it was coming down to, and that generated a lot of opposition in the community and was not something that was taken to the next level. But that is always out there.
Chip, you mentioned that sometimes a bus in the morning, for example, might be used twice for public students, and then another run might be private students. Do we ever mix the public and private students on a bus? And if we don't, would that make sense possibly?
No, we never mix bus destinations. So we don't have buses going to Aiken and then Braeburn, or Sedgwick and then KP. I mean, there's always, a bus goes to one particular school. So just as we don't mix public schools, we don't mix private school destinations or in between. So there aren't kids going to the same, two different schools on the same bus.
The timing basically doesn't allow for it.
We had seen in a previous report, just as an example, and I think it was at Newtown or something, where they almost went to drove everybody to a central hub, like almost a bus terminal, and then went out from there.
Every town is a little bit different. They've generated their own approach. I know in the town that I live, they drop at the middle school first, and then the high school, and then reverse in the afternoon. So, but the schools are physically close to one another, so but it's rare. Most cases, in the majority of the cases, you're taking one group of students to one school on one route.
Thank you.
Okay, you have, there's more of your report, right? So no, that's okay. So let's go on with the report, and then we'll hit you with more questions.
Certainly. So the big takeaway is that there's this unknown. The good news is that our 3 tiers can operate and change the times within our 3 tiers without any significant impact, maybe small impacts, but if we decided to put elementary first and high school last, it would not change the cost of our primary structure of our costs, which is important to know. So the takeaway is the private schools are a big unknown and the costs associated with that. I will move on. Just briefly, there had been some suggestions for looking at, a 2-tiered system. I would say that there are benefit. This is just a hypothetical. The benefit would be that it would be easier to get more children after 8:30. There would be a significant cost, probably upward over $2 million, because we are looking at about 79 large buses in the same run. So you couldn't double up at that point. And then we still have the outlying question of the private school transportation. So this one, the benefit we see is ability to make, decisions that could put more children at the later time kind of easier, but definitely a bigger cost number. Okay. Some other transportation considerations we wanted to make you aware of is that we do have middle school students. There's probably approximately 20 to 25 children taking middle school children taking high school courses per high school. So I think there's 20 at Conard, about 25 or more at Hall. These are middle school children who take advanced math or advanced world language, period 1, at the high school. And we'd need to consider ways to support their continued advanced growth, given that if the middle school was not after the high school, that would be we'd have to come up with another solution. We wanted you to be aware of that. We'd have to work closely with the Open Choice Office and the magnet school students who attend either the half-day programs, that attend the half-day programs. The Open Choice program is transporting thousands of children in the region, so it's not expected to, correct transportation is an enormous operation, and they transport thousands of children to literally hundreds of locations. So we would work with them. It's not anticipated to be a major obstacle. Same as some people had questions about field trips or late buses. We expect small changes in late bus times, but very little impact on field trips. They all currently, for no extra cost, can start after the last run starts, so you can use those same buses again, and that could generally be the same scenario. So those are the major areas we studied under transportation. We also wanted to give you an update on how we're doing on the stakeholder outreach committee. And here we have a parent, Doug Crichton, a parent, Karen Tiernan from Hall, Catherine Dean, a teacher, Shoshana Lazuski from King Philip, and a teacher, Karen Bridges. I cannot remember her school, I'm sorry. But they led this committee or subcommittee, and we have our website up. We have a dedicated email. We have 29 responses that I'll share with you at the final update on stakeholders. We have been updating our work in our school newsletters. We've asked principals to bring this up both at PTO meetings and at faculty meetings. We presented to the Parent-Teacher Council, I think that was in January. We've had some nice press coverage, as you see tonight, so we hope we're getting our word out there. The stakeholder survey was released on April 18th, and it will be open till May 15th. And we were having a family information night in 2 nights, and it will be at Town Hall. We invite you all to be there. Did send you a Google invite. I hope that worked for you. We expect about 30 minutes of presentation to give people background on who's on the committee, what we've been up to, some very brief overview of our work, and then allow people to have a public comment so you can hear from them, and will be timed much like you do here so that we can hear from as many people as possible. And we've asked WHC-TV to cover that event or tape it, and I believe they're going to do both. We'll have more information for you in June when we have the results of the survey. We do get updates from Hanover Research, and currently we have about 5,000 responses so far, which seems high, but it's not when you think about the number in the denominator. There's a lot of parents, there's a lot of secondary school students, and there's a lot of teachers. So we are very much in line with what we expected. We moved to the next subcommittee. This was a committee that looked at what's happening for West Hartford. This group was also Andrew Clapsaddle of Sedgwick and Sean Passon of Hall High School and Catherine Dean. They reached out to daycare facilities, recreation groups like West Hartford Youth Baseball, softball, lacrosse, groups like that. We reached out to leisure services, and also the Hillcrest Area Neighborhood Outreach Center, which services that section of town. Where there's an outreach center that provides support for families, tutoring, snacks, after school programming. And, as a group, they said, we will be willing to adjust when we know what the times are. We really can't say what the impact will be, other than we will need advance notice to adjust. And, the recreation groups generally don't get on fields till 5, so they realize they might get pushed back a little. Leisure services mentioned that most of their programming is later than that. They don't expect an impact. HANIC is a specific consideration because currently there are teachers who work there too, and if elementary school children are out before some of the teachers who work there, who might be different levels, we just have to do some configuring. But this group, by and large, basically said without more specifics, it will be hard to give us more feedback. Our next subcommittee was our professional learning subcommittee. It's a great group. Tim Kessler, who's a department supervisor for science, Doug Crichton, a parent, Teresa McEwen, our president of the WHEA and teacher, and Shoshana Lazuski. And they gave us a very good report. They did talk about some staff were open to having a different type of professional learning schedule, perhaps in the morning. There are concerns among many staff that we could not do K-12 professional learning unless everybody was able to move to morning. And until we get some times, we wouldn't be able to tell. But a lot of their feedback that they found was from the teachers that basically really is preserving what we have that's so special in West Hartford about professional learning. I thought that was a real testament to the program we have here, that we have such dedicated time, that we have teacher choice in our professional learning. The structures support the teachers to grow as classroom teachers and academically, as people who deliver academic content, to grow as members of a school community that helps children and families, and that to grow also as members of this large town and district. So our professional learning has many features, and it rotates throughout the year. So you might have a week dedicated to just your department work, just your work as a math teacher, and the next week is building, and you're working at the building level and what's best for the building priorities. And then there's time for collaborative inquiry where you can choose what to do and work with a small group of like-minded teachers who want to study something together. And also they said don't forget about the parent conferences. We have to prep well for those, and parent conferences are on that CSI calendar that we produce. So they were very protective of all the features that we have, and said no matter what happens, make sure we preserve these very important features. The board asked for us to look again through the literature at the social and emotional impacts, and this was often tangled with academic or with health in general, but we as I stated in the report, we couldn't read certainly all the literature out there, but what we did read, the benefits cited in very many different studies included more satisfaction with sleep, more, they would say, improved mood, decrease in depressive mood, elevated mood, so lots around positives around mood, less daytime tiredness, fewer visits to health centers in school, which could be health or could be tired and health. A lot of these factors go together. Increased positive attitude towards life, persistence, being able to stay with something either behaviorally or academically, and decrease in reports of depression we saw across several of these. Those were some of the common themes that we saw. Finally, we know that we've been presenting little bit by little bit since December, so we wanted to give you an opportunity to just kind of look over in a very brief summary what we presented to you, which this is about 3 slides, but the summary of sleep research was basically no challenges. I mean, the challenges are all of the other things, but the benefits are very clear from the AMA and the CDC and these other groups about health and improved mental and physical health outcomes. Lessons learned, we did see Wilton successfully implementing an 8:20 start time for 15 years. We saw Newtown feeling like they're off to a very successful start at 8 o'clock with few glitches. We saw Greenwich on the challenge side really struggling, at least initially in their first year, with maintaining, there's concern about maintaining all of their athletic programs, dismissals from classes, and loss of learning time. In the academic benefits, we saw kind of both in what we found. We did see some articles citing evidence of improved grades, attendance, and decrease in tardiness, but yet we also saw some articles said it was very difficult to quantify. Some said there was initial gains and then it wasn't sustained. But I think, as we said at that meeting, Wilton kind of said it best when they said, we didn't do it for that reason. We did it for other reasons. In athletics, we spent the last meeting really talking about all the challenges there. The benefits may be, kids are sleeping more. There's some research around improvement in performance and some research around decreasing in injuries. We spent last meeting talking about the challenges we would face with cooperating with other school districts and the amount of dismissals that would hit, especially in the fall. On the stakeholder impact, we really still have a lot of information to come there. So we don't have anything to say other than more to come. And then today, we just reviewed the three-tier system. It seems like it could work no matter who goes first or second, but we have to consider private schools. Town of West Hartford, a little too early to tell without more specifics, but people willing to work with us and certainly want to be on board with whatever changes. And finally, what we just went over, the professional learning. So that would be time to take any more questions.
Okay, could you go back 3 slides to the first one of the next one, yeah. The lessons learned Greenwich challenges maintained due to increased early dismissals for
Fall.
fall, okay.
There was a lot in the fall. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
due to increase, yep.
No, I think we're all looking forward, again, to more information and what we're going to hear Thursday night as well, especially input from the public. We do expect to see a number of people there and hear what they're thinking, so looking forward to that.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
And thank you, as well as Paul and Chip. I think my question, and probably a comment as well, because what seems to be a common theme or thread is around the athletics and the transportation, and I guess how our district would, I don't want to say compromise, but probably present a challenge to the other districts that our athletic teams or events are competing against. And for the towns who have successfully implemented the late start times, would you be able to comment or talk about how did they kind of get over that hurdle in terms of addressing that initial transition?
And Carol, I just want to be clear for athletics? Okay. What we learned from Wilton was they implemented this 15 years ago and asked for agreements from their conference partners, which I believe is the FCAC. That's a Fairfield County Athletic Conference. And they did get some cooperation. They were able to make some adjustments. They do have some early dismissals too, to accommodate. So they did a combination of early dismissals with some cooperation from the FCAC schools. And they, I believe in their first few years, they were 8:15, and I believe later they switched to 8:20. Newtown Newtown has 2 lit fields. That helps a little bit. They did not go to 8:30. They only went to 8 o'clock. So that made that, I'm also going back to Wilton, they did not go to 8:30. They went to 8:15. So that, and then 8:20. So I think that those start times worked a little bit easier, perhaps. They have 2 lit fields. They moved some games to a different schedule. They asked for some cooperation from teams. They have seen a sacrifice in warm-up times. Sometimes their kids are getting to games and having 5 or 10 minutes of warm-up and needing to go into the game. And they cited that. But other than that, they have managed it pretty well.
Agreements hold up over time.
Paul just mentioned the agreements over time. Wilton did mention that the agreements initially were pretty good, but they had heard, some schools have said to them more recently that, they're still willing to cooperate, but sometimes they have to make decisions which is in the best interest of their own children, and sometimes they cannot cooperate, and that came up again this year. So the agreements are handshakes. They're nothing set in stone, so they potentially could change over time if it becomes inconvenient. And then finally, Greenwich. We read in many of the published reports that Greenwich was struggling with dismissals, a number of them. They were looking at 2nd and 3rd lit field. They have 1. They were working with McBroom and McBride on a 2nd fully lit stadium field, and then lights on that to shine on a 3rd field. So they're looking at investing in those to make that easier. We did read about a number of their early dismissal times. And they have been asking for cooperation with their league. And again, getting it in some cases and not in others. So it's not a clear path, and each school is a little different based on their geography, the time they chose to both start and end, and then their ability to look at their resources for 2nd and 3rd fields.
Thank you very much for all of the information, and thank you also for providing more information regarding the social emotional benefits or insight as well. So a two-pronged question. One, recognizing what you just shared in terms of some of the challenges that some towns have found. Was there any information stating that in spite of those challenges, the benefits still were evident in terms of the social emotional aspects, in terms of improved mental health, and also in terms of long-term benefits and more longitudinal studies, maybe not seeing immediate impact, but any information shared in the long run, the benefits that may have been gained?
So I think for the first part of your question, we asked Wilton if they would go back, and they said no. So I think that says a lot in very few words. Wilton has maintained this system for 15 years, I believe. I think they started in 2003. So they are not interested in going backwards. So I think that says they're pleased with whatever sacrifices they've made. They are pleased with them and are staying the course. In terms of long-term studies, that we certainly read early on about schools which started this more out in the Midwest near Minnesota that made those changes in the early 2000s, late 90s and early 2000s that have maintained later start times. So we did ask Wilton the specific question of, did you see an academic benefit in this? When they said, we have never looked at it. And we're not interested in looking at it. We are happy with what we have, and we certainly didn't see any decrease in academics. So did I answer your two-pronged question?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, some of the science that we've heard previous at other times that was reported, and even in this information here, 2010, 2013, 2014, and the committee, I believe, looked at this 10 years ago, was it ish?
15.
Little more?
15.
And it wasn't conclusive then. And I've asked this before about the blue light and the kids staying up. And I just did some Google research, and the first iPhone was in 2007. Think about that. I kind of always thought it existed. I don't know why. I mean, and I'm old too. But in 2007, and if you look at these 10 years ago, that the school start times, adolescent sleep, 2010, 2013, 2014, and how the science back then, 10 years previous to that, didn't really come up conclusively that there were effects. And that's what kind of was concluded 10, 12 years ago. And I've often think that, that this phone technology 10 years ago versus what science is out today, and 2010, 2013. So if you go 10 years, it's 2000, 2003, 2004, and our first iPhones and our first real blue light came out in 2007. And so I'm wondering, yes, so the science says 10 years ago it wasn't conclusive, 10, 12 years ago, but now it is conclusive. I'm wondering how much of that really has to play into the iPhone piece. And a little statement too, and kind of all segues in together, a statement from Barbara Bush that's kind of recent on our minds. Home is the child's first school, a parent their first teacher, and reading their first subject. And Barbara Bush said that. And why I say that is because it's important. Parents are the difference maker often. And I think we often let them, when we talk about how successful our schools are, of course, we're proud of our teachers, we're proud of our professional development, but parents play a very big role in the success of a child's education. And when you look at that, where does the sleep happen? Sleep happens at home. And how are we can be responsible for that? We're not. It happens at home, and parents make that responsibility. And if you look at it over a year's time, we only have our students in our classrooms 10% of the time. So over a year, so summer break, winter break, and all that, we only have the kids 10% of the time. So that all kind of plays into, technology, parents at home, how that affects it, the blue light, what's keeping these kids up at night. And there's just thoughts that run through my head, and like, how do we change that? We're looking to be, the push, but there's some pull going on here too. I often looked at, and I tried to get some of the numbers, and I can't get them in front of you, but we know for a fact that kids aren't working like they did 10, 12, 15, 20 years ago, significantly. And I often think, well, why? Well, they're busy with sports and education, and parents have the wherewithal maybe for them not to work and such, and I understand that. But think about, at least for me, I had 3 jobs through college that we were tired because we worked, we went to school, we played sports, we did those things. Kids aren't enjoying those same work, or don't have, I don't want to say work ethic, that's not the right word, because, if a child chose not to work, it's the parents have been able to afford them not to. But you think about that. If they're not working, are the kids as tired as they were 20, 25 years ago that were doing the same work in school, the same athletics, and the same after-school programs, but yet they had a full-time job or a part-time job? And when we talk about that, segue into even some discipline. The military has recently changed and is changing the discipline. And I'll just have a quote here, because we talked about the Air Force Academy research as well. The situation we face today is really like anything we've ever faced, certainly in the post-World War II era, Wilkie told the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee, of personnel and readiness. Their discipline is changing. We have to change the discipline in the military. So if you take that section, that dichotomy, it could say that our kids aren't as disciplined as they were before because the military has to change it. So that was an interesting piece as well. And I said this before too, but I'll just repeat it for everyone here, is South Korea currently banned 16 and under from playing video games from midnight to 6 a.m. and it's called the Cinderella Act. And there's tech addiction centers that are all over the country. So that plays into, the iPhone release, the 2007. Kids are playing different and doing different things than previous. So that's an interesting piece as well. And I've said this before too, is sometimes we always talk about leadership, right? And leadership sometimes comes with following. And you don't always have to be a leader. In this case, if we changed, we potentially could be a leader in the area. And sometimes the best is to follow and let those in front of us make those mistakes. Because we also learned that South Windsor decided not to go any further with the study, and Simsbury is currently slowing their process. And in both cases, their difficulty in scheduling athletics and increase in transportation costs play a role. So when I say, they were trying to lead, they decided that something else is in the way. So again, you don't always have to be a leader. You can be a great leader by following. Just a little more tidbits, because I always said this too, if you walked into any arena in the United States and you got everyone's attention, whether you're at a rock concert, wrestling match, basketball game, football game, and you stopped everyone and said, how many people in this arena need more sleep? Everyone's going to raise their hand. Everybody. And I'd argue to say that they wouldn't. And Super Bowl Monday, businesses lose productivity due to sleep. It shows that all need it, not just adolescents. So it's not just an adolescent issue, it's really an issue for everyone. And I'd argue with you to say that who doesn't need more sleep, right? But again, because and I think I mentioned this earlier too, and we really haven't gone into any of this research as too, but if you look at the time zones, here we are in the Eastern Time Zone standard. So our Eastern Time Zone go out to Michigan, half of Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, except a third of the Panhandle. And just today in Bangor, Maine, sunset is at 7:40. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, it is 8:43. It's an hour and 3-minute difference. And Bangor, Maine's in the middle of Maine. It's not all the way eastern coast. And sunrise is at 5:24 in Bangor, Maine today. And in Grand Rapids, it's 6:36. So we just spent time in Florida, and my kids asked me, he said, Dad, how come the light's different down here? Well, and this is why, because you're different areas. So I wondered how seasonal effect disorder, the light has a play in this, and then that blue light plays into this, and how that affects with the time zones. I know Massachusetts was doing a time zone study to look at where, it would stop with Connecticut and keep New York in a different time zone. Study hasn't been, I don't think is out yet, but it took an effect that, we have Wall Street. So it's a big, that time zone means something to Wall Street. The other thing I mentioned previously too, in which science supports, is that the kids in middle school do play in the morning. And I forgot, and I never really knew what the acronym stood for, but I drop my kids off 4 times a week at 6:35 in the morning, and they play for, I think, an hour-ish of sports, dodgeball, basketball, whatever that may be. Different athletic sports, and the science that supports that is that if you get your motor running, well, we could sing a song, can't we? If you get to exercise in the morning, that you're ready and more vibrant for school. You're shaking off those cobwebs, if you will, knocking off the morning rust, if you will. So there's science behind that it works. And I got to tell you, dropping my kids off in the morning, there's a line. It is like pickup at middle school. So that's just something else. I know we've mentioned it here before. The professional learning that was mentioned here as well as in the study, and I've said this as well. I repeat myself a lot, I guess, but that the difference, why does West Hartford always come out top of its class? We're often set aside that we're the best in this, best in that, Connard this, Hall that, middle schools and our elementary schools getting accolades all the time. And I've always said, our outstanding teachers, of course, and our administration, but those professional learning days are what separates us and the rest of our peers and around the state, around New England, and around the country. We continuously to do well in those national results, and our kids are a result of that. And if there's any effect in that, as the teachers showed, then we really need to look at that with a microscope too. And even though Wilton, which I'm surprised, didn't look at any academic advantage if there was or was not, and they didn't really care, I think, Paul, you reported that we saw such small academic increases that it wasn't even really measurable, or it was measurable, but it wasn't significant enough to report. I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but.
No, correct. The academics, in terms of our standing,
Just ours,
as to
yeah.
where we are on academics, our graduation rates,
think
it wouldn't be the reason to do it.
No, I
'cause we
think
won't
Mark's
see it.
talking about like first period versus fourth period. Is that what you were talking about?
Oh, correct. We did a study on period, which is just an observational study, not changing anything. So we just looking at, under our existing start times, all kids coming, did kids perform better in one period versus another, later in the day versus early in the day? And there was no statistical difference. With one cohort, it was very, very slightly above, and then with a separate cohort, we looked at it was very, very slightly below, but not appreciable, the equivalent of like 2 points on a test.
Okay.
But, I go back to, I can reserve my comments, but academics, yeah, I don't anticipate if you choose as a board to make this move and you're hopeful that the academics would be a difference maker for you. As Wilton says, it's not the reason to do it, because I think as a high performing district, we're not going to get any more juice out of that.
That's what I was getting at. So, and the last piece I'd like you to leave you with is that, it was also discussed about the stress and emotional health of kids. I look at this as actually, taking, if there are kids out there that have a hard time waking up and they're emotionally stressed with the hours that school have. If switching it, you're going to switch it to other children, you say your athletes, that will be emotionally distressed, if you will, because they're going to have less time to study at night, less time to do homework, less time to do everything. So it just gets pushed to a different arena. So it's not, this isn't, in my mind, this change or potential change doesn't just help everyone and it's a magic wand and it's good for everyone. You have to look at the consequences throughout the affected groups. And our athletics, as far as having the amount of time home to do what they need to do, is significant. So not a lot of questions, I apologize, but more statements and just observations that I've gone through since this has started, so I appreciate the time.
Hard to follow that, Mark. So I will say that we don't have any purview over adult sleep times on this board, but we do have purview over school or adult work times. We do have purview over school times. And I've been thinking about all the pros and cons as you've presented now 3 times in the last several months, and really, really appreciate the depth with which you're going into looking at the various aspects of transportation, academics, athletics, and all sorts of potential impacts. And a lot of pros and cons. I think this is increasingly, I find this more challenging every time you come forward. I find it more challenging. But I do think it's worth continuing to explore. And one of the ideas that I've been tossing around, and we've had some sort of offline conversations, is the idea to start high school late once or twice a week. I know that Kingswood Oxford starts late once a week. That's actually where I got the idea. And I thought, maybe we should think about the idea of starting, say, Wednesdays, still having a short day, but making that short day go from 9 to 2:15 instead of 7:30 to 12:48, I think it is. So I've sort of tossed that idea around. It would give students one day to kind of sleep in, catch up on sleep, and or if they are early risers, have a leisurely morning, maybe have breakfast with their friends or mom and dad before they head off to work. And I think it's worth exploring, and I'm wondering if you can just present some of the pros and cons to an idea like that, based on any committee feedback or any of the other aspects.
The concept was talked about just a little bit, not in any detail, because the question arose, if it was Wednesday, for instance, then would we put the professional learning in the morning? And there was some, okay, that might work, but the biggest question to that is, could everyone go in the morning? Because it would be ideal to keep all levels together. So let's say you were able to move high school to the morning, or high school and middle school to the morning, but not all 3. We would struggle to do pre-K 12 professional learning, which we don't do every time, but it would be something we'd have to work out, because currently our teachers get out on Wednesday and high school starts their professional learning by 1:30 and they stay till 3:30. The middle school comes at 2 and they stay till 4, and then elementary school comes at 2:30 and stays till 4:30. So there's a period of time they're all together. There's a period of time you can do, some solo high school work if you're, let's say, the arts department chair who has K-12, or music is K-12. So the idea of the morning, and Kingswood does have a Thursday morning with, a Thursday late start with professional learning in the morning, I believe. So it was talked about, but the professional learning committee had just 2 concerns. One is, please preserve everything that we already have. They were very adamant about that. And second would be, we'd really have to consider the effect of if we broke groups up. If you could only do 2 groups in the morning because of whatever you chose, and then 1 in the afternoon, you just have to think about how you would keep everyone connected.
I'm going to jump in, I'm sorry. So I've thought about this question as well, because I heard it. If we made a change like that, I'm going to say something a little stronger than Ann did, that I would need to find a way to maintain a structure where pre-K through 12 could meet. I couldn't have a structure where it was impossible for them. So We haven't investigated it to the degree to which I say it could or couldn't happen, but if our townwide supervisors, if our special educators didn't have the ability to meet as a K-12 group, that their services and their curriculum would, over a long period of time, feel the effects of that, and it would be a negative impact. That's the biggest piece. Our elementary do meet, those time schedules are correct, but our townwide folks have the ability to flex the time schedule for professional learning so that they can meet as a K-12 group. Our music department, our art department, our ESOL department, and our pupil services, they frequently do that. They don't have to do it every time, but we would need to maintain that. So that is the biggest giant obstacle for Paul.
Couldn't the high school professional development take place after school still? And then they would have the same overlapping time the way they currently do? It's just the high school teachers would no longer be the first ones out, that's all. But they would still
I'm saying
have
we
the same
haven't.
time, right?
That would sort of be the question of what was their release time
Right.
that you were bringing up. So I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm saying we haven't gone that far to figure it out. I would just need to make sure that it could happen.
Gotcha.
Or it would be, for me, it would be a non-starter if it couldn't.
So, just to clarify, you're not talking about bumping everyone on Wednesday, you're talking about bumping just the high school?
Correct.
All right, that's
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And I'm bringing this up because we have the family information session on Thursday, and I want to make sure that that people who come know that this is an idea that at least one, and I can only speak for me, that I'm considering when we do eventually get to the point of making recommendations.
So I have another question as well, and again, I know you had different phases of information that's presented, so just to make sure that I'm understanding it well, it seems as though information has been presented from a nature and a nurture aspect. In terms of the nature aspect, I know originally information was shared from a biological aspect in terms of adolescence and why, in terms of melatonin level not being present in their bodies until later at night, and that being a reason why they may have more of a difficult time waking up in the mornings. And then I certainly recognize the nurture aspect is all the pieces that we're talking about as well. So I just wanted to make sure that piece is recognized, that we certainly need to recognize the science of it in terms of developmentally, biologically, what evidence is being spoken of in regard to starting at a later start time.
That is what a lot of the research said. They're looking at both biological versus environmental effects. And the research we read said that the children's melatonin levels change and they have a harder time falling asleep. And that outweighs the environmental factors, homework or staying up to talk to your friends or whatever. But that was present in the literature.
I have a question. Has there been any discussion so my issue is around the transportation costs. You mentioned with the private schools and that there's an unknown. What, if any, conversations have taken place with them as far as, hey, obviously they can follow along on TV or through the news as far as what we're doing, but have there been any offline discussions between you guys and them as far as, this is where we're at, this is what we're thinking, is this something that you'd consider? Because you kind of, one of you said they might say we'll just stay with what we're doing. I mean, has there been any of that communication going on?
Without actual start times to approach them with, we didn't, because we know the answer from working with the daycares and the town. The first question was, well, what are you proposing? And without being able to give them an answer, we didn't go down that path yet. But if depending on what you all choose, that would certainly be something that would have to happen very quickly.
That's a good point, Rob. It's one of those questions where, obviously that's a stumbling block with the transportation with the private schools. And I think that that's something that, Ann and the committee this year have done their study work, which was the goal to look at, okay, this is the study. And so we had ideas about how would this go during the course of the year, but with the study, you got more information, things I hadn't thought of. I know Ann, the committee hadn't necessarily thought of at the beginning. It's been truly informative. And so that would be a question where, at what point would you discuss with the other private schools. It's really a question for you as a board. Would that be at a question of when there was a time selected that then you're proposing, would they be in agreement with? And so that's something for you to mull over the next month, I think, before giving us marching orders of how we'd move forward either during the summer, next year, things like that. So, yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I don't know why you would wait, because it seems like it's such a key part for me, because at the end of the day, we're looking at, from what I understand, a possible $500,000 increase to our expenses with transportation. To me, that seems to far outweigh everything else that we've talked about here as far as the benefits versus the costs and everything. Based on everything we've gone through with the budget season, I just don't know as a town or as a board how we could even think that this is something we can afford. So I think that those conversations need to happen now before we even have an exact time figured out, because we have a rough idea. And then we could at least take their temperature of like, well, you know, we're not sure of the exact start time, but, you know, if we propose that we're going to move forward with this, what is your reaction to that going to be? I think those conversations would be fruitful. If they're like, it doesn't matter what you do, we're not moving. I mean, that tells us something. If they're like, well, it depends if you push back this much time or that much time, maybe we'd consider it. I think that would help us as a board really know like what we're up against, because if it's a hard no, I really don't know how as a board how we really can take this, because when we started hearing about this, at least it was my recollection, you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but I always understood that when we were talking about the science of it was great, this was supposed to be a revenue neutral proposal. And so I was all for hearing about what this could do for our kids. We all know as adults we're sleep deprived, but we're talking about our kids. So now that we're kind of finding out in May that, hey, guess what? Like, there's a very real likelihood that this cost could be a six-figure cost to the tune of almost $500,000. I don't think we could even go beyond into the two-tiered of like, that's potentially almost a $3 million expense to us. I don't know how we can consider this as a serious, it's a serious financial impact to our town. And when we're being told by the town that we're going to be cut, and then we don't know what's going to happen next year, it's certainly based on the science, very much compelling information, but we're simply not cash rich in this town. So I guess I'd like to know what they're thinking, because for me, it's a hard no if we are going to be absorbing a huge amount of money.
Can I just follow up on that, because I totally hear you. If I understand you correctly, that the buses to the private schools are separate. I mean, we share them, but they're separate runs. If we don't actually change the times so much as rearrange the times, then there wouldn't be any impact to the private school, right? Is that correct?
No, because there are different runs going to different places. So essentially, yeah, I think my understanding is the way you guys set this up is you're here gathering information, trying to make a decision as to a first step. We got a whole year to sort of implement this thing, and you're going to have a budget cycle in 18-19 that at that point in time, there will be a clear, in other words, we need to spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what this is going to look like. And then we can come up to you with specific things saying, okay, school X can fit in here, school Y wants to go here, and we can readjust everything. It's not simply rearranging everything. It's much more complicated looking at the whole logistics in terms of what our costs are going to go up and also the town's costs are going to go up. And if we increase the town's costs, that's not going to be particularly...
Right, but that's what I'm having trouble understanding. So even if the high school, the private high schools, for example, stayed where they were, and we swapped the middle school and the high school.
So you're saying flip middle school and high school?
For example, but then, right, but the private schools stayed exactly where they were, how would that change the numbers?
Because middle schools use different numbers of buses than high schools use. So depending on where those things are, where the slots are that we can fit in, every time I've taken a look at this thing, you just have to take a look at it holistically. You just can't take a look at it, oh, we can tweak here, there. What we can say is if we swapped everything and everybody agreed to swap the same sets of times, elementary, middle, and high school, this would be the cost. Other than some minor changes because of some route issues, it should be the same. But if people don't change, we need to reallocate everything throughout the whole system. And we need to spend the time because you've got 6,000 kids going to 25 different schools at 3 or 2 different routes. You just need to spend the time to take a look at it, and I believe that was what the gist would be for next year. There may or may not be a cost associated with this when everything is all said and done, and that would be something you would address in the 2019-20 budget cycle. Wow.
But I think what that suggests then, to go back to Rob's point, is that we can't actually make a decision until we have a proposal. And I mean, again, this is not a criticism of anybody. It seems to me that rather than say, okay, we're going to move forward with X or Y or Z or we're not in June, that we say something like, okay, under this circumstance, let's explore, the best guess for us is we go to a high school 8 o'clock. I'm just making this up, right? And then we take the time to say, okay, now we have a proposed plan. Now let's go forward, have these conversations with people, ask these questions, get an answer, and then decide. Right? Rather than make a decision.
Or it's putting the cart before the horse, right? I mean, because
Right.
we have no idea, and so why should we waste staff time for a year planning to
Exactly, and
vote
then
this
say,
in,
surprise.
and then we find out, like, when we're actually going to go forward, oh, okay, well, it's $700,000, and so we got to put the brakes on, and then we're not going to do it. I'd rather not waste your time.
No,
Let's
that's
find out up front.
Yeah, and that point, Rob, that's what we were, and I didn't say it properly. Yeah, this was the study. What are all the areas behind it? Now you're in the nuts and bolts of reaching out to people, but to reach out, you need to say, would you be willing to do this if this were the time? And so I think that over the next month, you'll have input Thursday night, you'll have input from the survey, certainly we have budget information, and that's a huge part of this. And then you can at least say, okay, if this were where we were going, then yeah, that's exactly what we need, agreed. Yeah.
So I guess the cost estimate, because again, I just want to be crystal clear. If we make a decision in September and we say yay or nay, and we say yay, and then we find out in 2020 it's going to be, $452 to $3.1 million, that decision isn't then an educated one. And it was a poor decision on either way that we went unless we have all the information. Now, having said that, if the cost estimate between 425 and 3.1 million is the estimate that you guys can come up with now, before September, October, before the vote, because I think we would need a very sharpened pencil on before we vote so that the number is indicative of our vote. Because if the cost is $510,000. I think people would vote one way, and if it was neutral and it was zero, I think people might vote another way. But there's other impacts with sports and all that. I'm trying to dumb it down very simple to one number. So yeah, I think in the next 6 months before we vote, I'm imagining you go to the private schools and say, hey, can you guys do this if we do between 8 and 8:30?
Yeah, my assumption with the private schools is I'll be honest with you, I don't think it's easy enough to get feelers. We've spent a year studying this, talking about it.
They're not willing to?
Community. No, they are. Well, I shouldn't speak for them. But I don't know that their headmaster would be willing to say to me, yeah, I'll do that, without having spoken to their community, their staff. I mean, I think they would need a similar process.
But now you've got the news here, and it's not an unknown to them, and they know that we're considering this, and they know that their private buses come from the town. So there has to be some thought into that, or maybe they just put their hands up. Listen, we're keeping it as much the same times. So I think they're already thinking about it.
Well, they may be, but I think they would talk to their parent community before they would do anything.
But I also think
they don't have a horse in the race, honestly.
That's true too, because it doesn't.
I just
cost
wanna-
to them, right?
I just want to back up to make sure I'm clear, because I'm hearing the discussion, and to go back to the initial inquiry. My recollection was the initial inquiry came. There was a parent group that presented to the board, and the board said, this sounds like something that we should be talking about. And Mark, you'll appreciate this more than others, because the military decision-making process, like, we were tasked with figuring out, separate facts from assumptions, and basically be able to provide you the parameters so that you could develop courses of action. And then you feed us the courses of action. That's what we're anticipating that's going to happen. And then we'll be able to do that detailed planning work to be able to say, okay, here's all the impact, and here's, based on the courses of action that you're considering, this is what it would mean, and if you want us to recommend for you, but here's the parameters, here's what it is. And it sounds like we're trying to fast forward in that process to have those things, and we'd be happy to do that, but we're 3 steps back in the decision-making process, just defining all the parameters.
But Paul, I mean, what you're absolutely, but what you're suggesting in a way is a clarification of what I think I at least originally thought how this was going to work, which was you present us the pros and cons, we say, yes, we want to do it. It sounds like, to me, it's more of a multi-step. You have now provided us, here are the scientific reasons that it makes sense, there's emotional issues, blah, 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 right? Here are the challenges in terms of transportation, in terms of in terms of athletics, whatever, right? And now we can say, okay, all things being equal, we would like to explore, I'm just making this up, we would like to explore a later start time. What if we looked at 8 o'clock? What would that look like? Then, all we would vote on is, yes, let's look at it. But then it seems to me, at least what you're suggesting, and I certainly agree, is that we wouldn't be voting, yes, let's go to an 8 o'clock or 8:30. We would be saying, okay, what would it look like if we went to 8 or 8:30 or whatever we decide? And then everybody goes back, because Anne has nothing to do if she doesn't do this work, right? Okay, so we've said, okay, let's look at 8 o'clock. Or whatever. And then now you go back and you say, okay, how is this going to work? How are we going to get 6,000 people in 12,000 places, right? And then you come back and say, okay, well, if you want to do that, it's going to cost $100,000. And we say, okay. Or it's going to cost $500,000. And we say, okay, no. So at that point, that's when we decide.
If I can just speak very briefly on the committee's behalf. They, through the whole process, have been wanting definite times to look at because it has left it more wide open. And I have said to them, the board has not given us times at this moment, so we need to look at the overall challenges and benefits. And quite frankly, I wasn't on the transportation subcommittee. I kind of oversaw all of them. I was surprised by the possible cost. But it is hard to approach organizations to make kind of big decisions with any real response coming out, with any response you can count on, unless you have some parameter. And so almost every meeting we had, some member of the committee would ask, do we have any more specifics of what they're looking for? And I would say, not yet. I think they want to hear this piece. And then when they get to a more specific request or please research this, we would be able to do that. So I certainly understand, frustration of seeing this number, but at the same time, it was very hard to approach anyone without, and expect a response. We could have approached them, but we wouldn't have gotten any type of, we got responses like we got from daycares and sports leagues. Well, you tell us when, and then we'll tell you. So I think that, was a challenge through our process this year, just doing it in the kind of holistic approach, but
what I do understand from what you're saying, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were. Is that the buses the transportation piece at least looks most likely to succeed if we keep with these 3 slots, but move people around. So if that's the case, then it seems to me that in June what we need to talk about or think about is, first of all, do we want to do this at all? But if so, how would we want to move the slots, right? And so those really are, it's not like we're going to move everybody an hour later or something like that. That's not going to be realistic. So that we've kind of narrowed it down, it seems to me, to either doing nothing or to some kind of swapping the 3. Is that right? Wouldn't you say?
The key is maintaining the 30, for the
The
cost
3.
on the biggest part of the transportation of West Hartford Public Schools in the 3-tier.
Right.
The key is maintaining a 30-minute window and not having too many buses in one tier. That's
Right.
the real.
But also these particular 3 half-hour slots, because unless the private schools were.
So 2 tiers probably credit much more expensive. I'm not going to commit to exactly these 3 slots or not, because that because lots of schools are on different times. In other words, some schools are on a totally different time, and because they're on a totally different time, they have a 1.0 bus that the town is entirely paying for. If you switch the schedule around, maybe they can fit in to one of our things and become the 0.5 bus. So you just have to look at it holistically, sort of figure out where you'd like the time slots to be from the impact on the non-economic impacts. In other words, how it impacts athletics, how it impacts social emotional status, what the impacts on professional development are. And then you give us some guidance, and then we can really do that detailed routing analysis at that point in time.
Yeah, and again, this is, I don't mean to be harassing you guys. I'm just sort of talking to us because we have to think about, okay, what times do we want to shoot for if we're going to investigate this at all? And we're all sort of making this up. I want to finish, but I do want to say before the end, if either of you have anything to say as people who are living the schedule, don't hesitate to weigh in. But Mark, you wanted to add something about this?
So again, on a parliamentary level, is that, are we going to discuss, okay, are we going to vote on, let's have them study 8 o'clock, let's have them study 8:30? I don't necessarily think so. I think that the way this even generated was inquiries from the podium right there, right? And we asked that they do it. We didn't vote that we asked them to do it. It was a discussion here. At least I don't remember that we voted, say, yes, do a study on change of times. I don't think we did that. So I find it hard to understand that if we sit here and then in June we say, because we're not the busing experts, and we don't know what's the most efficient and routing and such, that we just say that, listen, and again, I don't think we would vote, okay, we would like you to start an 8:24 start time, and yay or nay, right? I just don't think that's how it works. It's that we ask that they give us a number for tier 1 or tier 2 that is most reasonable, and go from there, and then give us a cost associated with those tiers as close as you can get. And I'm not looking, I'm not going to, no one's losing their job because they were, $15,000 off or anything like that. And, the financial report, there's a lot of estimates anyway going forward. So I'm perfectly fine with Chip and his estimates as the subject matter expert. I just don't see it going as a vote and saying, okay, I want 8:30.
Actually, I think
here you presented us the information. Now provide us the numbers that it would cost so that we have them as a board. I mean, I think it's as simple as that, but I may be wrong, but I think that's how we should proceed.
Well, that's actually, I agree with you in a way, which is to say, I understand that you want times from us. I think we're feeling like we don't know. We think all the data says that we should have later start times, but we're not the ones who can adjust these other things. Who's the one what body is best suited to say, ideally,
Let me
this
see if
would
this
do it?
helps or not. Maybe it keeps the water nice and muddy. Paul personally doesn't want to be in such a confined box that you say it needs to start at 8:37 and finish by, What I would be looking for personally would just be the general parameters, because I don't envy having to sort through this, and I expected that the whole purpose of us being here was to help you sort of say, what are the things that we feel are important? The difference between an 8:30 start and an 8 o'clock start are, is something different, is something of debate that I think, but I'm not interested in, does it need to be 8 or 8:30? But I'm interested here, do you want it to be close to 8:30 or closer to 8? Here's the unpopular thing. To Lorna's point earlier, there is no debate about the science, the melatonin secretion, the positive, I can't measure it, but I'm not going to second guess that there wouldn't be a positive impact to school climate and to student mood and those sorts of things. I can't quantify it for you, but I'm just going to say that's going to be all well and good. In the same breath, I'm going to tell you, we're not going to see dramatic changes to our academics, our graduation rates, not the reason to go down there. So the unpopular, sort of obstacles are athletics. it's going to impact our athletics. We're going to get some agreements, and we're not going to get other agreements. The concerns that you need to be thinking about are the individual sports, the sports like tennis, where you have, you're one-on-one or two-on-two, and you have to wait in line before you can get onto the facility. The places where you've got the private facilities, golf and swimming, because a change in time is going to have a more dramatic impact on those sports. And then, of course, just what happens with your fall sports. Obviously, you all know that you're very interested in what your parent group is going to say relative to the child care and how quickly the community could respond to the change. And so their voices hopefully will come through nice and loud at the community event and also through the survey. The one that I'm most concerned about is the instructional time and the lessons learned. And again, that points back to athletics, where kiddos have had to be let out of school early. And in terms of what you tell us for general parameters, our collective job and my goal is to work as carefully and as hard and diligently as possible to minimize students getting out of any loss of instructional time, And then transportation is kind of the wild card financial piece to it. So we know what the pros are. We know what the obstacles are. I think what we're going to seek from you is, how do you weight those different things to your first question? Do you do it or not? And then in terms of knowing the later you go, the bigger the impact on those things, just generally.
That's the essential nature here, is that this is a board-generated discussion. So to Rob's point about transportation, if the question comes to me, would I cut $400,000 elsewhere to have late school start times? I would not. So you're looking at a community conversation that we've had outreach, we've had study, but for us to say, well, if we just flip, or if we go, we do need some guidance. Is it a half an hour? Is it an hour? Is it nothing? Because that's really, while I appreciate you trusting us and understand what you're saying, we still need a little more guidance in terms of what exactly are we looking at.
So again, just so I can say this back to you and so that I understand it. Assuming that the parent response or the whatever isn't so overwhelmingly negative that it negates any further conversation, it sounds to me like what we're saying is most of us are willing to entertain a later start time, but not so late that it's going to create all these other problems, right? And so that and again, I'm just sort of feeling my way here, but so that the idea at the June meeting, after we hear about the parents and talked about this, is, so are we talking about roughly an 8 o'clock start time, roughly an 8:15 start time, roughly a 7:45 start time, right? And then you can take it from there. Is that?
Well, that and the idea of, are you willing to flip others earlier?
Right.
Is it bumping or flipping? That's
right.
The key.
And that we would have to, that I think depends largely on information we don't yet have, like from parents. Right. But that's the conversation. So you're not asking us to say, okay, look at an 8:10 start time. You're asking for us to say, we don't want the problem that Greenwich is talking about, where half their staff is leaving early. We're not interested in that. But we're interested in seeing if a slightly earlier start time that's not going to get into that, right? So okay.
So just to kind of just piggyback on what you're saying, so I don't know why I want our administration even ever doing that, okay? Because as Paul just said a few moments ago, maybe it got lost in the noise of the muddy waters. The private schools have no incentive to make this change. There's no cost to them. So they're not going to do it. Unless someone wants to refute that, and we can let this play out over the next month or so, there's no reason to have them spend so much time after we say these are our parameters for the time period, when at the end of the day, so fine, then they reach out, spend a lot of man hours going back and forth, chips like going through 3,000 pencils, and then we're going to be like, okay, yeah, so the cost is $478,000. That's too much, because Tom, how can we ask Tom to do that? So I guess as a board, maybe we can just simplify this and just say, okay, understanding that this additional cost of $452,000 to $510,000 is a real number that is potentially facing us if we move forward with this, regardless of what time we kind of settle in on as parameters that we make them go off and figure out. How can we justify that expense? And I'll say as a board member, I can't. I can't ask Tom to find that money when we can't find any money already. Like, we just went through that. Like, there's no money. There's no slack in this budget, right? I mean, that's the message that we heard. There's none. So how do we find almost $500,000? How do we ask them to spend their time doing this when it's $500,000? I think we make the easy decision that we can't afford this, so we're not going to spend any more time doing this unless there's some sort of thing that comes up in the next month that totally disputes what I just said.
So I would align my comments with yours as far as wanting to spend any extra money to make this work. But I think that the potential incentive for a private school to change its start times is the same incentive that we're looking at, which is the research is not secret. We know it's better for high school students to start school later. We know it. The public knows it. The private high schools in town know it too. So maybe their incentive is the same as ours, which is maybe they, for all we know, really want to start later. And the reason they haven't started later is that they rely on us for buses. So for all we know, they may jump at the opportunity to change their schedule. I do think it's worth asking them.
And that goes to my earlier point of why maybe that discussion needs to be had, because if anybody knows, correct me, like I don't assume that, since we have no purview over them because they're private schools, if there's no initiative going on right now among any of these schools to look at this, then why it's suddenly going to start now? You know, I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it is their philosophy, and they like how it is working for them. Just because West Hartford Public Schools is making this change and it's no financial impact to them, what is the incentive for them to change?
Well,
I guess that's my point.
You know, it gets very complicated. So, I mean, the reality is there is a state statute that says we don't have to spend X per pupil on private school transportation. So if all of a sudden we are spending what we're spending now, we're spending double, we can say, oh, you got to absorb the increase, or you got to switch your time. So there's lots of.
We don't have the purview over that. The town council does.
Well, they're going to want to
There are so many. There's so, you know, it's totally.
Well, that just got kind of more muddy. Yeah. We didn't talk about that. So I mean, it's just getting more complicated, and so I'm not confident, just based on understanding the history of this, that we're not going to be held, end up holding the bag, so to speak. So I don't understand exactly how that's going to play out. That would push come to shove, would the town do that, and would that actually happen? And then so they're on the hook for it. I don't know.
I just, you know, Deb, you mentioned that there's information, the melatonin levels and such are irrefutable. I've heard the word used. But what I was getting at earlier is, again, I pointed out the dates that these studies were done, and they were previous to any of the blue light from the phones and iPads and such. And there's irrefutable data out there now, too, with that research that shows that that has an impact on those melatonin levels as well. And because of that impact, and why I earlier mentioned that when this study was done 12 years ago, not just 12 years ago, our science hasn't changed that dramatically, right? It's not like the Earth went from flat to round, right? It's our science from 10 years ago is not incrementally different than it is today. However, what has changed, and they found that the information back then was inconclusive on the melatonin levels. Melatonin levels haven't changed in adolescence and such over the last 30 years, or maybe they have through different environmental phone use and such like that. So, because there is information out there, and I will bring it at the next meeting because I have it, that kind of refutes exactly what this is saying, is that, because for every information, for every yin, there's a yang, and there's stuff out there that says, yeah, these phones have an impact on the kids' melatonin levels and sleep levels currently. And that's why, if you look back at 15 years ago, it was inclusive because the phones weren't available to the kids at that time. So I just, irrefutable and science, and I'll bring it in. And it's an interesting. It's no one's reporting that part of it. We've heard it, from the parent group that reported to us and such, so that there's information out there that's on the other side of it as well. And phones and iPads and such have a huge impact on kids' sleep today. And I think, I know as a parent, I don't need to study that. I know what my kids do at night, It's real. It's in my home, so I see it.
I just want to say two things. The first is actually that the Earth did change from flat to round. And I mean that seriously, in the sense that the science has completely changed. I mean, it's not, no, wait. What I mean is they can read brains in different ways. The science did not exist before because fMRIs did not exist before in the same way. So they really are looking at different sorts of brain information than they looked at 10 years ago. So that's partially why the science isn't there. Which is not to say that you're wrong about the blue screen. I'm just saying that it is, in fact, a dramatic scientific change that makes it now possible to make these arguments. But the other thing I was going to say is that I would not be surprised if blue screens have an impact. But there we are. And so even if it's true, it doesn't change the fact that that's what kids are doing, and it doesn't matter what parents do, they'll do it under the covers. Right? Realistically, if that's what our kids are doing, then we need to respond to that. But anyway, I just wanted to say that. No. I'm not disagreeing.
Okay, and fine, too. And if you heard me earlier, is, parents are the difference makers here. And I said that earlier. And, again, we have the kids 10% of the time. And so, yes, are they going to do it under the covers and such like that? Yeah, they're going to do all that stuff. The kids are amazing. You got to love them for it, right? But I think that there's a responsibility there too as well. And I do it at home, come on kids, and I think that there's a responsibility there, and you can't always point it at, we provide an environment to kids succeed in. Would anybody argue with that? We provide an environment for all kids to succeed in, right? We do that, and we do it very well here in West Hartford, and I'm proud of that. There's stakeholders here as well, and I think that regardless of what we do in this time, I really would like parents to get involved. I can't do that. I'm not going to do that here, sitting here, but I think that's a huge component. I think that there's a generation lost here as far as what happens, with these kids at night, versus what happened 15, 20 years ago, with the phones and such. And I just think that if we curbed it, again, I don't want to curb it, but I think that there's some liability on the parents for it, and I'll land it at that.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I did want to say about the science that we now do know more about children's brains, which again doesn't have anything to do with parents, but it does seem to me that they now know things about kids' sleep cycles that are realistic. But I think, to get back to the original point, all of us agree that we went into this on the assumption that this was going to be more or less revenue neutral. More or less. It doesn't have to be zero, but we're not interested in talking about $500,000. So now that we have, and up till now, everything that you've presented in your committee has been, well, you could do this, this is a cost, but it's not been a financial thing. So I understand you, Chip, to be saying that it is still possible that we're talking about relatively revenue neutral. We just don't know yet. So if it's not true, if Rob's right that no matter what we do, we're looking at $500,000, then we're right. This is not going to happen. But if you're right that some guidelines will enable us to move forward and there is a possibility that it will be close to revenue neutral, then I would say it is worth continuing this conversation. So I just wanted to straighten that out.
And I don't want this to be a line in the sand. If it's 5,000, we don't do it. If it's 450, we do it. Because again, I talked about it earlier, is you're pushing, say these, your emotional people that have difficulty waking up in the morning and are emotionally depressed with the current situation. You are going to probably move that problem to your athletes. You know, we didn't talk, I said it earlier or before, is that, you know, currently, even your track, because of the meets that you're getting out of school at 12 noon now. So if you're going to lose that extra hour, so if you're going to move a problem from someone that can't sleep, that can't wake up, you're going to move it to the other end. You know, it's going to be an elementary shift to those kids. So what are the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few? Where does that work? You know, so if you're going to move it, you've got to consider that as well. It's not a financial thing only. You're going to move emotional difficulties in another direction.
And if I may say, I think with that, I appreciate you sharing that. That is something important, but I think it's important to acknowledge that those consequences, what are they manifesting from? One is from an organic piece in terms of the biological aspect, and one would be more from a situational stressor in terms of the reaction to something that's currently happening. So certainly valid question, but it's also important to recognize what is it manifesting from?
An athlete not getting enough sleep because they're staying up later doing more homework because they're an hour later. So it's environmental. It's you know.
Okay, I just wanted to comment on the fact that, yes, we have iPhones and we have iPads and all of that, but that's not something that we can control, or we can't do anything about that, or you guys can't do anything about that. So what you need to do is look at the generation and the era in front of us and adjust and give them the best shot, and how we can give the students that are coming in the best shot, because we can't control the iPhones. That's the parents' job. We can't mandate the parents to do that. So I think what you need to look at is how we can provide this environment best for learning, and that's going to be a later start time, and the data just shows us that. And yes, we have the kids 10% of the time, so how can we make that the best 10% of the time? When they're positive, when they're awake, when they have the most sleep. And this is not really giving just the kids with mental health more sleep. It's giving us everyone benefits, all the students benefits, because we hear this chemical is produced in our teenagers' brains at 11 p.m. and stops being produced at 9 a.m. And we need to adjust that for all teenagers, not just the kids with mental health. It's for everyone. And I saw up there the studies are being shown that athletes, they're actually increasing their performance with the school start time is later, and it's decreasing injury. So it's helping athletes too, in a way. So we need to think about that too. And I personally I feel I'm echoing the opinion of most of the student body at Conard, that West Hartford is the town that can make this change, and we can do it. And we need to think about not if we're going to do it, but how we can do it and how we can execute it most effectively, and how we can execute it, of course, spending the least amount of money. So we just need to think about how it's so overwhelmingly positive for the health of the teenagers, how it'll help our mood, how it'll really help high school. And I think it'll just make it so much of a better, improved environment if this happens, in my opinion.
And also, I have noticed that a lot of times in secondary education that the question between athletics and academics has come up, especially in college admissions and just high school in general. And I think that we are in school to learn. And yes, athletics are a plus, and they're something that many kids need. But I'm not sure the exact percentage of people who do athletics, but I'm pretty sure it's not half of the people.
It is.
It's 70%? Okay, my apologies. But I think that debating between athletics and mental health, that the health of our teens overall should be foremost no matter what, and that we're going to school for school. So, yes.
I think I got to clarify, because I think you may have misunderstood. When I talk about the mental health piece, it's not a particular student that's receiving mental health studies. It's the mental impact, if you will, the sleep, the deprived sleep that they're not getting that's affecting them. So just a clarification. I don't want you to think, and my bad for articulating that wrong, is that I'm not talking about those particular kids that It's just that the ones that have trouble sleeping and waking up, and that affects them mentally. So just clarification.
I also want to clarify that I hate getting up early. I never liked it as a student. I don't even like it now. So any students watching, please don't throw a brick through my window. I'm on your side, like in theory. I just really don't like getting up early. If my wife ever watches this, she'll laugh. But for me, it all comes down to the math, Chip. So I can't sit here unless we have concrete information that the town is not going to be adversely affected budget-wise. I just strongly believe that the private schools are not going to make this shift. I don't care how much we talk to them. So if there's a $400,000 or $500,000 increase, I don't know how we asked Tom to. He's already looked in the sofa cushion. So I just don't know. It's my personal belief is that I don't want these good people to spend the next 12 months really spending so much time on this issue when there's so much other important things to do. When at the end of the day, at least for me, I'm just a no. I'm just a no. So you guys have lots of other good work to do. If we can just get a certain answer on, this is going to be our liability, or there's a very reasonable chance that it isn't, because I'm kind of a contrarian when it comes to math, or at least when it comes to our town accepting costs. And in my gut, I feel like we're going to absorb this $500,000 based on what I've been educated on so far. So just prove it, or otherwise, I just don't see how we need to go into any more of the science discussion, because it's the math for me.
Well, and I think what the lesson is that the next thing we have to do as a board, once we hear from the parents, is say, okay, here's what we want you to look at. Here's a concrete proposal within the parameters of, 15, 20 minutes either way. Let's do it. Let's try to do this. The first thing you need to do is talk to these people and find out, right, so that it doesn't take you 12 months. If you say, look, there's nothing we can do, then that's that. But it sounds like we have to get enough of a concrete idea so that you can then go and give us a concrete answer, so that then we can move on. And so and again, we can't do that until we get the feedback that's going to come Thursday and afterwards. So I guess, are there other questions about this particular piece of the conversation, since we're going to have the rest of this again in June? Oh, Dave.
Hey, I think it's been about an hour since I chimed in last. Thursday night is very important for the parent input, and I'm just curious, are we all able to make that? I know I will be there, and if you can't, it's going to be on WHC TV. Please do watch, because parental input is important, and I think especially after all this discussion that with the news here and Ronnie and Michaela's stories and what's going to happen on Facebook, I expect a good turnout. And it'd be interesting to hear what the parents have to say about it, as well as the students that may be in attendance.
And just to be clear, we're there to listen. We are not there to comment or anything like that. We'll be there because we want to hear what parents and others have to say.
And the survey, I'd remind parents, you can look at the survey of two ways. We survey for our climate surveys every year in the building, so we routinely do a survey that gets thousands of responses. But then sometimes we survey about other things. This has had a very large response already to that. But we're talking about, we've got, I think at this point, thousands of student responses. No, I know, I'm bringing it down. Hundreds of teacher responses, thousands of student responses, and more than 1,000 parent responses. So we do have a good cross-section when we get that survey. And that's with, we have over 5,000 responses, and we've still got another 2 weeks to go.
Can I ask a paranoid question just about the surveys? Because they're anonymous, how do we know who is actually filling out these surveys?
Great question. So we did get some questions about that, and we are working with Hanover Research for a couple of kind of stopgaps to make sure that we have good information. And one is, of course, all IP addresses are collected, which is great. Second, we are looking at our response rate compared to our climate survey, which would be really good. We also have it broken down by school and by group. So it's not just this massive number. We know how many parents at Aiken School responded. We know how many children if we have 10 kids from Aiken School responding and we didn't send it to elementary school children, then we'll know we have a problem. We also are going to get all of the data in SPSS format, which I don't know what that means, and Excel format, so it can be completely reviewed, and if there's outliers, we can take care of that. I know you didn't ask this question, but it came up in one email at one point. The reason the IP addresses weren't locked down is because they're going to be taken in schools by the kids, and so that address would have been used multiple times, and that's okay if it's students. But if that's a home address and it's not a West Hartford address and it's used 30 times, we'll know there's a problem. So we'll be looking at the data. I'll rely on Chip quite a bit for that. And we've been working right with Hanover. As soon as I write to them and say, hey, we have this concern, they write right back, here's a solution. So, and they give me multiple solutions. So I'm feeling very confident that between looking at the responses, disaggregating it, and getting the data, we will have good results.
Yeah, if you end up with 6,000 to 7,000 responses, for someone to be able to tweak the survey, they got to respond 1,000 times. Yeah. Realistically, and that just is, that's not happening.
Right, and I just wanted everybody to hear that because those questions have been raised, and so that's very reassuring.
That's a good question because technology exists today. I was able to go in, you have how many kids you have in the school system? 3. So I thought that and it said you can do it multiple times for each because I had a different level. And I thought, okay, I did my 3, I'm done yet. They asked me if I wanted to do it again. I was like, well, that's an easy algorithm. 3, you can only do it 3 times, but that.
What's your IP address?
I did it only 3 times. I did it for each of my children because they're different.
Thank you. Okay, we're good. Thank you so much for your patience and your answers. But Paul, don't go away. You thought that was the long one. We have another new topic, district profile and performance report. And Paul Vicinas and Dr. Andrew Morrow and Dr. Gretchen Nelson will all help report on this.
This is, if you recall, we're now, this is something that, why am I forgetting what it used to be called? The School Strategic Profile, the SSP, is now the PPR. But there was a gap in between when we had nothing. And this is actually something that is in our bylaws that we present every year, the results of our PPR. We actually, it's also in the state that Board of Education need to review it. And I want to thank, the work Paul does and Ann does. You see what she's doing with school climate, Kerry. But this data to come in aggregately, you can imagine the questions that we had. And really, Paul's had basically 3 weeks turnaround with me, Andy, Gretchen, saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Why is that? Because everything's, we'll get, when we talk about attendance, that's a classic example of, okay, what does this really mean? So I just want to thank Paul publicly before he begins. Go ahead, Paulie.
Thank you very much. And thank you, for the conversation as a board on the start times. I don't envy you, and just regardless of where you are in the topic, you guys are really engaged in work for the community. So tonight we'll celebrate some of our successes of our collective work, and we will very frankly identify some areas where we have continued growth and we are setting goals to make improvements. You should have had in your written report, I hope was included a nice blue report, which is the PPR. There are copies on the table for the public, and for those still awake at home watching, as is indicated in the written report, you can access all this information on the State Department's public site, ed site, EDSIGHT. Just Google it, it will come right up. And tonight we'll talk through very quickly, very quick overview of the purpose and what's in the PPR in general, and then we'll start to look at their West Hartford indicators, and they should be broken down into these kind of 4 big categories: student and educator data, pupil services data, college and career readiness metrics, and performance and accountability. And as soon as we're done with that, we'll open it up for questions from you. All right. But in general, when you think about purpose of the profile report, it's kind of the larger purpose of all the different state accountability system, which ties into our state assessments, which ties into state-derived policies for attendance and everything else. There's an overriding goal, it kind of pushed in federal legislation, to have a transparent system by which parents can look at and assess the quality of schools. And so that the federal government can also look at and assess the quality of schools. Based on all the different, Connecticut uses one system for its accountability measures and one system for its student testing. Other schools have different things, so it's kind of like, how do we take all the apples and oranges and varieties of fruit in the fruit stand and come up with a common metric that helps us to understand it. From the State Department of Education's lens, what they did in an overhaul of this system from the SSP, as Tom talked about, to what it is now, and the underlying plan that is there, is they said, hey, we want to do more than adequate yearly progress. We want to do more than simply reporting out to parents, this is the percentage of kids that were above the line, and this is the percentage of kids that are below the line. We want to start to have a system that speaks to the comprehensive sort of experience that we call public education. So aside from just academic achievement and the ongoing efforts to reduce gaps between and among groups of students, they looked at their goal for college and career-ready graduates and put in some metrics that would hope to measure that. And they put in some stuff in terms of that well-rounded, civically engaged students, and they put in some metrics that don't necessarily measure that perfectly, but it's their best first attempt in terms of actual things that they can grab. And you put all that together and you get this performance and profile report, which is extremely comprehensive. It's an 8-page report. It's got 20 separate data tables and 3 narrative sections, and the metrics, as we said, are broken into these broad categories. And we'll talk a little bit about each one. So with that introduction, if you're ready, here we go. All right, student and educator data. In this section, really the things to look at, and this is found on page 1 of the blue report. You're looking at enrollment trends in diversity, absenteeism, and discipline when we talk about students. And I know that you get a much more detailed report on our enrollment trends for CHIP, so I don't try to reproduce that. I'm here simply to kind of speak about, you see there, what are the areas in which we're growing as a district, what are the areas in which we're stable. So we see that our Hispanic and Latino has been highlighted. It's one of our faster growing groups. We're currently at 18.2% of our population is Hispanic or Latino, which is up 2.5%. over the last 3 years. And so we speak about this frequently as diversity in our district as being a strength. And you've heard Tom talk about within 5 to 10 years we'll be a minority majority district. And it just speaks to the ongoing work that we have within our curriculum to make sure that we're constantly reviewing and making things so that our students see themselves in what's being there. The other metric that's of note is the slight increase, up 1% over 3 years, in our students with disabilities. This is a population that has had small incremental growth each year, year after year, despite the fact that our trends of our overall number of students go down a little bit. The second student data statistic to look at, and I think Tom mentioned, is chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is defined as any student that misses 10% or greater of the total number of days enrolled for any reason. This isn't unexcused or excused. This is vacations. This is sick days. This is anything of that nature. This is homebound tutoring, unfortunately, under new state definitions. And in an analysis of looking at our PPRs, this was a statistic that we didn't necessarily have on our radar in the past couple of years, and we have observed that we have a 1% increase over the 3-year average. So it's a number that's been going up incrementally over time, and we took pause and said, that's something to look at. To get a kind of sense of what that really means, that's missing 2 days in a month as a student. So it's something that's easy to sort of slip by and potentially go without notice if it's not a giant number for a student. But it could potentially have an impact. And I think we'll probably talk some more about it. But to give it some context, I did look at some of the districts that we compare ourselves to: Farmington, Simsbury, Avon, South Windsor. They all average about 5%. So the idea that we've gone up 1% over the last few years to 6%, we're not terribly far off from some of the towns in our DIRG. But we're certainly better off than some of the surrounding Hartford communities, such as Manchester, which was at 17%, East Hartford, which was at 14%, and we're well below state average. But it is something that we're concerned about, something that we're going to make a goal in terms of how we're pivoting our services to make sure that we can pay attention to that. With that is a truancy count, and our truancy count went up substantially. Truancy is defined by the state of having 4 unexcused absences in a month or 10 unexcused absences in a school year. And we see that the number has nearly doubled in the last year. Interestingly, truancy kind of spikes under this state definition in middle school, not so much in high school, where attendance and credits are kind of conjoined, so you see a fall off with that. And it's generally not a big issue across most of our elementary schools, but there is some differences. So that's a piece that we're looking at and we'll talk about. Moving over to educator statistics, really the one that I want to highlight here is our educator diversity. And we know that an effort tied under Board of Education goal number 3 is to increase the diversity of our teaching staff to more closely reflect the diversity of our students. And I'm showing that our current level of diversity, teachers of color, teachers other than white, is 8.1, which is an increase of 19 teachers of color over the last 4 years, net. All right, and that's compared to a net increase of only 3 white teachers over that same time period. So it's incremental. It's gone up from 6.4% 4 years ago to 8.1%. That seems very small. However, when you consider the average tenure of a teacher versus the average tenure of a student, we're not going to make the same gains in this category as we're seeing reflected in our student demographics, but incremental growth is positive, and I think I'm excited to know that we've added that number of teachers over that time period, which hopefully students will begin to sort of notice and see over the course of their career. The next big block in the PPR is called instruction and resources, but it kind of lumps together pupil services data with some college and career ready metrics. So I'll talk here just to identify some quick trends in the categorical distributions. I indicated that the student with disabilities population has ticked up percentage-wise. Where does that happen? We're seeing increases within students living with autism, students with emotional disability or dysregulation, and other health impairments. All other categories, to include, what we would call learning disabled, have remained fairly static. Speech and language, minor decrease. But by and large, it's students like this. And I point this out because generally students that have this label probably require some either smaller settings or more. It may have a budget impact for Gretchen that she can speak about if you have specific questions. So I thought it was a good statistic to highlight from this section. The other one is outplacements. When we add together public and private school outplacements for our students, our current figure is 17%, which is up 7% over the 2-year average, which is a fairly substantial increase for the number of kids we're talking about. But again, keep in mind that that's always very specific to the individual child's needs. And I think it speaks to what Tom's talked about. I find these statistics interesting. We're a victim of our success in terms of we do become a destination district for students that may have some specialized needs based on our excellent reputation among parents and the services that we provide. So I point these out because, there's a cost for us to be able to continue to provide our services. College and career readiness is the next statistic that falls under this heading, still on page 2 of the blue form. And the first one that I'll kind of highlight is access. This is grade 11 students and grade 12 students reported separately in the report that are enrolled in, whether it be an advanced placement course, a career and technical education course, workplace experience, or dual enrollment, something like the UConn Early College Experience or our partnership with Central Connecticut State University, or and this is just the first of several great news stories for the district. We're up 9% among our juniors over the 2-year average to 71.8% of our students having access to college and career ready courses, or I shouldn't say having access, I should say taking advantage of the access that they do have, and 87%, which is a 5% bump. And I'm pleased to report that's not just more of our majority population. Those statistics, when you break into the report and you look across our Hispanic, you look across our Black, and you look across specifically English learners, free and reduced lunch students, all had big gains in these categories. So it's just an excellent news story that we're very happy about. And of course, getting there is one thing, and then making the achievement is the other. And again, another good news story, the college and career ready achievement statistic, which is not found on that page. You have to actually dig in on page 5 to this longer state accountability table. But I'll let you know that we're at this year, we're at 64% of students that have earned a passing grade on a college and career ready assessment. So that could be reaching benchmark on both the literacy and the math of the SAT. That could be getting a score of a 3 or higher on an AP exam. And that's a 10% gain over the last 4 years. So, and again, we're seeing an extremely large gain among our Hispanic population and an extremely large gain among our English learner population for this statistic as well. So it's a great news story. It's worthwhile pointing out that in the report itself, in the state report, there's a discrepant value for students with disabilities. It shows them at a 5.7% for this, and Gretchen brought this to my attention. We talked about the fact that that was a drop from 15%. For the last 3 years, we had seen 15%, 15 and change. And so we did some investigation, and we believe that that's an error in the state reporting. We're very confident that's an error, and we're working with the state right now to get that corrected. The correct value is actually be stable over the last 4 years at about a 15%. 15% is very different from 64%, so it's an area that we want to continue to provide emphasis, but pleased that we didn't have a decrease. All right, so I'm trying to move fast, but this becomes the hard part where I don't want to move too fast, because the next section of the reports on page 4 is the District Performance Index, or DPI. And this is a complicated metric that is easy to not be able to understand without some explanation. All right, so I'm gonna before I talk about where we are on it and all the successes and some of the challenges that we see, I'm gonna try to explain it a little bit. The District Performance Index, or the DPI, what it attempts to do basically is take your scale score, like you would get on an SAT, and translate it into a score between 0 and 100. All right? For districts, the score is between 0 and 100. For students, the score is between 0 and 110, because students can perform in the advanced band, and so therefore they should be able to get kind of something over 100. So what you do is you take, you look at the range of scores, say for a particular test at a particular grade level. The example that's here goes from a low of 2014 to a high of 2623. Well, that's great. Band 3, which is goal, has specific numerical bands which are pointed out. So you figure out where's band 3, and now you're going to translate that band 3 on that black line, which is the scale score line, over to that blue-green line on the left, which is going to be the index score line. All right. And so here's your bottom line up front, kind of a thing. If you get a DPI score of somewhere in the mid to high 60s, all the way up to a low 80, then you're in goal. Anything above a low 80, you're probably in the advanced band, and anything below mid-60s, you're not in goal. So mid-60s to high 60s, and it varies a little grade level to grade level. Mid-60s to high 60s, you're at that threshold of goal, all right, up to 80. So the state sets a target of 75 as a DPI. That's your target. That would place you solidly in the middle of the goal range. And the hope is that if I take all the individual student scores and I average them together, that we get an average of 75 as a district. That's the state target. That's what DPI is. And so that's basically the numbers that we're looking for. 60 is not a D, 65, 67, that's a good grade, all right? 75 is where we want to be, and anything above that is outstanding. So here's where we fell as a district for this year. And most of these scores, honestly, were already reported to you back when we did the long-winded report, both on the Smarter Balanced Assessment scores and also the separate report on the SAT. But for ELA, we're at a 75.7. We're at target as a district, and we're solidly in that goal range. In math, we're at a 70.3. Very exciting. We're up 2 points from where we were last year, which was up about 2 points from where we were the previous year. And we're not yet at that target, but 70.3, the understanding now is that's not a bad place to be. Our math scores over time have been, our ELA scores over time have been flat in and around that 75. Our math has been growing since we've named it an area of focus. Science is at that 65, it's hovering at that threshold mark, and it's down slightly. And my interpretation on that is it's down from a 10-year high. All right, so we reported in science scores, I think 5 years in a row that we broke our record, broke our last record, broke our last record. The luck eventually ran out. It hasn't run out with AP, but it ran out with science. But we're not in a bad place. When you look at the high needs versus non-high needs, you see those figures there. And what's most interesting with that information is we'll talk about the trends within high needs and where they're going. On the kind of frank and bold information out front, it's the third year in a row that we do have an achievement gap outlier, which is to say a significant gap for both math and science. However, the positive news is under that gap trend directly underneath it, that gap has been reduced by 10% in math and by 3.5% in science. It's extremely close. If we were to continue an incremental increase in science next year, we would not have a gap, and within 1 or potentially at most 2 years, we would not have an achievement gap outlier. Still be a gap, but it would no longer be an outlier, as it is not an outlier in English. Although, hey, bad news story there, the gap widened by 1%, but it's not yet an outlier. If that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, I'll take a lot of questions later. So achievement was one measure, and the other measure was growth. So every student has an individual growth target based on where they performed. Those growth targets are based on arbitrary numbers from the first year of the new assessment was given, and they just said, well, we'll look at all the growth that all kids made across the entire population, and we'll draw a line at the 60th percentile, and we'll say that's the cutoff. Everybody should have made what those kids made, so those other 40% of kids didn't make enough growth. And they set that as a growth target, which was kind of interesting because it kind of says, well, hey, 40% of your kids aren't going to make the requisite growth. So it's a very rigorous target. The target for growth is 100%, that 100% of kids should be able to make what only 60% of kids should make. Extremely rigorous target, but we're up for the challenge. So where did we land? We landed at a 61%, 62% in ELA, which is about, oh boy, I'm moving super fast. I am on page 6. It is a statistic that's hidden in the middle, but an important one. It is the academic growth index found within the state accountability measures after you read the achievement values. So our growth metric in ELA is a 61.6, and our growth metric in math is a 68. Again, that's a very positive number for math. It's 2.2% above last year. You see our corresponding high needs values, which does demonstrate less growth than the all students measure, but achievement gap is not calculated for growth. In order to try to say, all right, well, how good is that? Part of me says, well, if it's above 60%, since it's a 60% threshold, it's pretty good. But I doubt that would satisfy you, and it doesn't satisfy me. So I said, well, the best comparison I can make, since I'm not 100%, first, did it go up? And it did go up in math. It went down in English, as you see, by about a point. But how do I interpret that? Did I just have stronger growth last year? So what we did was I compared the percentage of growth to the state, and I saw that last year we basically had the same growth values as the state. We were not distinguishing ourselves in terms of our growth. Our kids made the average amount of state growth. They did not do better. This year, our kids had 111% of the state average and 110%. So they did 11 and 10% better than the state. So I take that as a positive trend, and that was true not only for all students, it was also true for our high needs students, 3% better than the state, and you can see that that's up from last year when I did the same comparison. All right, coming into the home stretch, taking this sequentially, we go into graduation rates. Graduation is broken out into 4 categories, and many of the graduation rates metrics are listed in 2 separate places. They're listed either separately on page 5 as part of separate graduation tables, and the on track for graduation is also hidden in page 6, as is the 6-year cohort graduation rate for high needs students, English language learners, special education students. They report their graduation rate separately as not just the 4-year, but as the 6-year, because, as you know, English language learners and students with disabilities we are legally obligated to provide education services up to age 21, with the understanding that they may not graduate in 4 years with their peers. So we have 2 separate metrics for that. And we'll also look at post-secondary entrance and persistence. Again, some of those statistics are hidden in other tables, so the slideshow kind of tries to highlight the important stuff. So I start with on track for graduation, which is a statistic measured for freshmen. The percentage of freshmen who earn 5 credits or more and no more than 1 failing grade in a core academic. We're at a 92.3, which is slightly below the goal. I believe the goal is 94%. But what's most concerning for us is that not just that we're down 2.1% this year, but I think we went down slightly the year before in the 3 years that this has been mentioned. So we're not in any dramatic danger, but it's something that we're saying, all right, we need to name this as an issue. We need to talk with our high school principal, which we have already. When this report came out, we named this as an issue. We talked with our high school principals. We asked them to engage the school counselors. We've revamped, we had already revamped the high school program to identify 9th grade counselors to kind of get them on this and to say, why is this an issue? What's most interesting about this statistic is that it is backward mapped to the 3 middle schools for the same students when they were in 8th grade, as sort of a measure of preparedness for high school for those middle schools. And when you do that, the on track for graduation statistic for each of our 3 middle schools is between 2 and 2.5 points higher than it is for the feeding high school, which tells us that at least a part of this problem is for students that are coming in new to our district in 9th grade. All right, so it sort of gives us a way by which that we can attack the issue, and you've heard me say that when we've disaggregated our SAT scores or some of our other scores, it's students that have only been with us since 9th grade, we seem to be having some issues there. So it points us to what we need to look at relative to our transition programming. Our 4-year cohort graduation rate, students who come in as first-year freshmen graduate 4 years later or earlier, 94% basically, up about 1%. It's just a great news story. And what's outstanding about it is if you break it down and look at some of the underlying statistics, you see that we've had gains in some of our minority classifications, which I can pull out into question and answer if you like. Fairly stable, up a tenth of a point in our 6-year cohort graduation rate. And then college entrance and persistence, also good news stories. This data comes from the National Clearinghouse, so it's reported as, this is the percentage of students who once graduated, enroll in I believe it's a 2 or a 4-year college within 1 year, all right? And so that's an 84.4%, up a point from last year. And college persistence, of those students enrolled as freshmen, it's the persistence to their sophomore year, and that's up a teeny bit to 92%. Again, all positive, all strong numbers, and all continuing to tick upward, so we're extremely happy. So the final statistics that we'll point at are participation statistics. I won't spend a lot of time on them. Our statewide testing participation remains at 99%. It's a flat figure. I know a question was asked, well, is that, if you disaggregate out the SAT, is it still that strong? If you disaggregate out the SAT, it's actually stronger. It's like 99.5%. It's 100% at a lot of our elementary schools and 99% at our middle schools. The reason the SAT only brings it down is because you get a whole month to test at the elementary and the middle school, and you only have 2 days to test at the high school. So if kids happen to be out, if they're unlucky, it is what it is. And
There is actually also a small number of kids that if they've already taken their SATs, gotten the score they wanted, taking it again that day, so it actually disincentivizes strong scores from taking it again.
thankfully for a very small number of kids. Physical fitness and participation and achievement. Interesting statistics here. We're up 1.4% in participation, and we're down 1.4% in achievement. The achievement value looks pretty abysmal. We talk about this each year. If you look at the individual subtests that go into the physical fitness test, we have an 80% pass rate across each of the 4. But in order to get a pass on the test, you have to pass all 4. So when you combine them all together, we only have 55% of kids that pass all 4. And arts access, I know we talked a lot about this at the board workshop back whenever that was. This is the percentage of kids that are enrolled in art or music class in grades 9 through 12 in a given year. And our 8-period day is able to accommodate about 46% of kids, down slightly, kind of goes up, goes down. It's not dramatically off from the 2-year trend, so it's not a concern, and it's not a metric that we would chase, but certainly something that we do promote the arts and we do a great job with it. I don't think this statistic captures that, but it's not something that we would chase to like revamp our schedule just to get a better score in this one little piece of the assessment. That was a fraction of the information that's in the report, but a lot of information thrown at you as fast as I could so that I could open up to questions.
Thank you. And maybe I'll start this time since I never get to, so it's my decision. First of all, I just wanted to call attention to something else that was good news, and only because it had been, someone had raised a question about it previously about absenteeism among teachers, about whether it was higher or lower. I just want to say that, I just want to flag the fact that in fact, as we suspected, our teacher absentee rate is lower than the rest of the state. So we're doing very well in terms of teachers. So students is another question, but I just wanted to raise some questions that are in the report, but that you didn't get to go through, because you gave just district-wide numbers, and they mostly have to do with race. So, for example, under suspension and expulsion in page 1, the percentage of Black and African American or African American students who are expelled versus the percentage of white, we're talking about 11.3% of Black students and 2.4% of white students. That's higher even than students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, or students with disabilities. I'm just wondering if it's worth considering whether or not the same behaviors are being treated in different ways by different, because of race, even.
Yeah, I'll let Andy
unconsciously.
jump in because that's a major topic of his presentation at the next board meeting.
Oh, okay.
Where we go through all discipline records from
We
the
break
year.
that, we do break that down, and we have those conversations at the high schools and at the middle schools when we look at how students are being addressed, whether by teachers, whether by administrators, and so that's something that we constantly do
Yeah.
take a look at.
And we do track it by administrator, by building, and actually, Andy and I get every suspension letter that goes to any child is CC'd to our offices so that we can, so that there's multiplies. That being said, your concern is my concern.
Sure. And
And
that's always
Sure,
something,
I'm
that's
just
always
flagging
something
this,
that
yeah.
we're working on, making sure at the high schools that we're doing things always with that lens.
And
Well,
here, and I'll just
sorry.
piggyback one thing, the four-year trend, we've talked about this statistic
Yeah.
every time that we've been up here. The four-year trend for Black and African-American students has incrementally decreased from 13.4 to 11.3. The white has incrementally increased from 1.8 to 2.4. So I'm not happy with the disparity, but the metrics themselves are starting to move in the right direction.
I mean, that's great. And again, I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm just calling attention to outstanding issues. And that same issue, of course, continues in both the DPI and the benchmark. I mean, there is greater access. I saw the access question on page 2 about 11th and 12th graders enrolled in college and career readiness courses. Again, Black and Hispanic numbers are lower than white, but they're at least in the same ballpark. But if you look on page 5, whether they've made the benchmark, the numbers are staggeringly different by race. So that, for example, for the watching audience at home, 74.9% of white students are meeting benchmark compared to 31.4% of African Americans, if I'm reading that
You are reading that
correctly, and 38.5% of Hispanic or Latino, and those eligible for free or reduced lunch. That strikes me as so horrifyingly high that, again, I'm not pointing fingers, it seems to me that is seriously
That is the gap
needs to
that
be
we
addressed.
continue to need to work on. The silver lining of that, I think I mentioned Hispanic Latino under the achievement they had a gain of 5.5 this year. But the disparity is the disparity. It's nearly a 2-to-1. The free and reduced lunch students also had a 6-point gain, an 11-point gain over their 3-year average. So while these disparities are dramatic, I want to sort of recognize that and reinforce this is a big piece of our work in terms of all the work that we do on cultural competence. But I think when we look at the incremental trends over 4 years, and you see some of those highlights in the written report, there's substantial sort of evidence towards, hey, we're starting to make, we can show how the work is making a difference. And while those gaps are still big and we are far from the finish line, we have taken several good strides down the road.
I think this is something, Cheryl, I'm glad you bring it up, and it's one of those things where it's, the good work that all of our leaders do, the good work that Rosina does, making a district focus on cultural competency, and knowing the work that we do. When I get these scores, they're all I think about. I mean, you can ask any of the administrators. And I'm very pleased to say that there are people looking at things different, like, Julio Duarte at Connor just sent a report of all the people nominated by race for National Honor Society. I never thought to do that. Those are the kind of things that people are thinking the right ways, because you have to think about it and name it before you can address it. And it doesn't mean we have significant issues we need to address as a nation. I came from a conference, Paparate. That was one of the more powerful conferences I went to. And you look at the under application. I mean, the Hispanic, Latina population, 1/4 of all kindergartners in the United States is Hispanic, Latina. That's only growing. By 2029, 1/4 of all of our students will be Hispanic, Latina in the United States. And I had the opportunity to go to a couple schools where they did some things differently and talk to leaders. Al Maharis, Superintendent of Orange County, and they're doing things in schools where, PSAT day, sometimes seniors don't come in. Every senior has to fill out a college application that day. That's pretty interesting. FAFSA, Rosina and I had a long discussion. Anybody here that has had kids go to college and has filled out a FAFSA form? And I feel like I spend my whole life on this topic, and then I'm filling out the FAFSA form. Oh my God. So Andy actually has already identified a Spanish speaker to come in next year to work with our families and to try to find metrics of who's filling out the FAFSAs. Because the other story about Hispanic students, this is a national story, is they're under applying to colleges based on their scores. And so this is a trend that we think about all the time here. I'm glad we're making gains, just as we're making gains in our staff is looking more like our student body. And I know the difficulties that come with that in terms of just the pool we're picking from. But I want to assure you and the families at home, we know the silver linings and the good direction. It's our biggest frustration. And it's not as a group, because all I can think about is that child. Listen, I'm thrilled with we can say the graduation number's great. It is. But that's 6%. So 6% over 600 kids, now you're talking about 35 real kids. And I used to meet with them as seniors the day they didn't get to graduate. So each one, and that's the only way we're going to address this, is by our school counselors and our teachers talking about each individual child and how do we reach that child. So I just want to assure you, it's not only do we share the frustration, it is absolutely a focus, and we try to learn from all of these reports and ways we can do better.
I appreciate that, and I don't mean to make anybody defensive. This is a national problem, and absolutely. And part of it is, colleges don't make it known that, in fact, there is financial aid. There's all kinds of levels of expectation, but I'm glad that to the extent that we can be addressing it, that we are. So thank you. Other questions, comments? Mark?
Just on the graduation piece, you said 6, but so the difference between expecting, what's the words they used? Because it was 7.7 actually.
On track versus
on track. So on track is 7.7 that won't graduate versus what graduates is the difference is 6%? Or the difference is 1 point?
Well, we're at 94% graduation rate, correct?
Yeah, on track for graduation, it's not that they won't graduate, it's that they haven't made the progress.
At the end of freshman year, they have catch-up work to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I use the actual graduation.
No, that's fine.
More.
Because I worry about those kids as well. That's 6%. In a town like West Hartford, and oftentimes when I see a literacy rate at 98% for the country, I'm like, oh, that's still a big number. It's 2%, that can't read, and I find that to be a huge number, actually. So the 6% is a big number for me for graduation, and if you're tracking it right freshman year because they're not on track, and that there's some improvement between freshman and senior year, I'd really like to see that number come down. And I know you guys do it every day. You go to work every day to make sure that number is decreased, but 6% is just still a huge number.
It is, and it's, one of the things, I don't want to appear defensive because I'm not. I agree with you entirely. But I'll point out a couple of things within that 6%. It's sort of like all paths don't, I don't know the exact idiom, but we've got.
They don't go anywhere.
Yeah, right. Within that 6%, we may have some students, some English language learners that have joined us, likely within their high school years, that are coming in basically as true beginners, that just aren't going to be capable, based on language proficiency, to accumulate the number of credits within the 4-year time. Likewise, students with disabilities who, maybe their disability is going to prevent them from that. And so there is a 6-year cohort graduation rate for those kids. So I don't want you to think that those 6% are dropouts. Likewise, we do have our REACH program, which is graduating, probably has in the neighborhood of anywhere from 10 to 15 seniors in a given year who started often as whether they're second-year freshmen or kids that didn't, some of those are your not on track for graduation kids. And they've landed into a support program that we have for them to get them what they need so that we can help them to graduate, not necessarily in the four-year cohort, but certainly at the end of the road so that they're well prepared for college or career.
And we've discussed the credit requirements for graduation increasing, and it's something there's going to have to be policy decided on by the board next year, because right now, there's our special education students, if we just transferred over to that graduation, our graduation rate would decline because they don't have the time in the calendar day to meet the new credit requirements. So we're going to have to look at what is awarded credit, and those are things we'll be discussing. That's a major task for the board for next year.
Thank you for that report. So I have a few questions. So the first question I have is around the chronic absenteeism and suspension. And my question for you all are, with the students who somehow received the in-school suspension, is that considered an absenteeism?
It is, according to the state. And the other reason we've seen some spiking in that as well is that the state made a change in some of the reporting. And so we have students that are on homebound tutoring for whatever reason. It may be a discipline issue that's being resolved. It may be a special needs student who simply can't access a normal classroom for a time being. It could be a student who is injured via concussion or something like that. But we have a large number of students at any given time that are receiving homebound tutoring, usually 2 hours a day or more as needed. These tutors that we have are not certified teachers, but they work under the direction of certified teachers. And it's always been the understanding that if you are on homebound tutoring, that you're receiving instruction and that you should be marked as attending school. The state decided that, well, no, if you're not receiving instruction from a certified teacher, so if your tutor isn't a certified teacher, then you're marked absent, regardless of the fact that we have students that are receiving instruction, that are a part of our school community, that are returning into our classrooms, that are taking the tests, that are receiving the same curriculum. They're marked absent on a daily basis now. So they're considered chronically absent because of the homebound tutoring requirement, which, again, we've gone to the state and just are almost dumbfounded by the logic behind it. But again, it's not our decision to make. We simply can report it.
I'm going to say one other thing about chronic absenteeism that Andy might be too polite to say, and there's no more cameras here, so I'll say this as long as you don't repeat it.
WHCTV is on.
Yeah, but that's local, I don't worry. Because I won't say any district by name. Because this goes back to when I was in Andy's position. State reporting of absenteeism shifted a little bit, and here's what used to be our practice. You're from Pakistan, you're coming in. Before you're coming in on December 15th, I meet with the parents and you tell me, my family's traveling to Pakistan. This is the first time we've been able to go back. We're going to be there for 3 weeks. Well, now you're chronically absent, or for 4 weeks. I mean, we can't stop a parent from where they go with their child. We can dissuade them. We can talk about the importance. Policy used to be, you're going to be away, you need to disenroll and then re-enroll when you come back, because then nobody was ever absent. We changed that, and now you're absent. We don't disenroll everybody. We don't disenroll anybody, I should say. Most
Because it's better for kids. That's
Yeah.
why we changed it. It's better
we don't
for
want to go
families and it's
through
better
the
for
whole.
kids.
We don't want to make a family go. It's a charade.
Yeah.
And I can tell you definitively, we measure far more accurately than most districts.
Yeah.
It is still a common practice for people to disenroll during that time because it skews your data.
So Andy, I wanted to go back to the students that are in ISS. Are they, or is it typically while they're in ISS, do they have some academic work to do, or how are they filling that time period?
Absolutely, yeah. ISS is considered, you are receiving academic instruction. We have supervisors who are supervising the instruction and the delivery of the work. We make sure that the administrators coordinate with those supervisors to make sure that each student has work from the classes that they're missing. We have teachers that will stop down during their teen period, during their free period at the middle school, during free periods at the high school to check in with the students. Today we're doing this exercise in class. I sent this down. Let's take a few minutes. Let's go through it. Make sure you have any questions I can answer before you do it. I'm going to be around at the end of the day to do that as well. So we make sure, again, anytime we're suspending a student, whether it be in school or very rarely, as you'll see, we've been shifting over the years to do more in school because we want to make sure that that instruction isn't being impacted.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was around your uptick with teachers that are looking more like our black and brown students. What about is there an increase in terms of the rate of teachers we hire that are bilingual? So either Spanish speaking or another language?
I'll be honest, I don't have any metrics on that in my head.
I can tell you off the top of my head, we have more students, we have more teachers speaking Chinese. But that's about, I don't think we've tracked that. Rick may have that information and could provide that to you at a later date.
Okay. The other question also, I have two more questions, and one was around the instruction and resources in terms of the rate of the Black or African American students and Hispanic or Latino in terms of how they compare against the white students. And my question is specifically around the AP courses. I know that that continues to be a struggle for us, but what I'm curious about is how does that conversation begin with those students in terms of being either introduced or early on in terms of when are they introduced? I know it's typical we wait until they get to high school, but is there any discussion even at our middle school level, the importance of why you want to take an advanced placement? What does that mean? What does that look like? And not so much in terms of the challenge, but just sort of getting used to taking this type of course and what do I want to say? Maybe, okay, I'll just say challenge yourself. Not necessarily to get the score on the test, but to begin to take courses where you're going to be challenged and not just settle for the easy stuff.
Yeah, so I can speak to that, and I like the way you asked, like where does that begin? And I think that's where, in terms of I'll talk about specifics about how we do it, but in terms of the metrics of how we see that changing, I think that's the big difference when we look at the access data and the trends in the access data over 4 years versus the achievement. Because I think we're starting to see much more narrowing of the gap in terms of the students that are availing themselves of the opportunity, and it is based on the conversations. The conversations definitely happen teacher to student, both in the classroom and with the school counselors, and it's a drum that we're always beating. Cultural competence is ingrained and it's part of everything. It's how we're asking folks to look at everything that they're doing, from course recommendations, from the selection of materials so students can see themselves in the instruction. But we're also doing a lot of work with student to student. We have a lot of student groups to include AP students that are going down into our middle schools, high school to middle school, and high school to elementary, some middle school to elementary. The most recent example I can think of, one of the elementary teachers was sharing that the chemistry students had gone down into an elementary, and they were judging part of a contest The students had to present different things, and I guess the teachers were judges and they were aides, and then in between they were doing demonstrations. But it's sort of like modeling for kids in terms of, hey, let's be smart about who we're selecting to send down, so that all kids can kind of see some older peers acting in that leadership role, and I want to be like that person over there that I met. So we're doing I think more of that than over the last several years. As one school started to do it, others have heard about it. We share it, and it's picked up steam. So I think when we do a later report in the year on equity and excellence, that could be a piece that we highlight for you, a number of the different examples of that we have. That manifests into the kids then starting to avail themselves. So when I look at the data on college and career readiness access, which I think was page 2 of the report, there's still a gap. I show white students as in 11th grade, basically being 75% of white students, in comparison to Hispanic and black, we're both at 61.5. Right? That's up from 46% for those groups last year. That's a huge increase, a 15-point gain, 1-year difference, and 15 points over the 2-year average. So that was a giant jump in 11th grade. In 12th grade, we see 83% black African American, 82% Hispanic, 89% white. So a very narrow gap between those groups in terms of availing themselves of the AP. And so now it's a question of, all right, let's get the achievement to be on par. We do still see the achievement gap. That statistic, state buries it in that larger report on page 6. And those gaps are still there, but again, they have narrowed, so I'd have to dig them out, which I can do if you give me a minute, but, here we go. Not as giant of a gain. I would point to my 3-year gains if I want to give you the wow factor. So black African American students had an 8-point gain over 3 years in their achievement. Hispanic students had a 4-point gain over 3 years with incremental growth each year. So those are positive values, but it's still, the white students are outperforming them in a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of the percentage of kids that are getting that, either getting that 3 on the AP exam or getting the benchmark score on both the literacy and the mathematics on the SAT. So there's a lot of work to still do in terms of culturally relevant teaching. It's the piece, we just had extended leadership on Thursday of last week. I'm trying to remember, I was sick for a day, so I've lost like a month of time in my brain. And Rosina did a piece where she was framing out what she wanted the next level of work to be within cultural competence, and it was culturally relevant teaching. And so she outlined a number of steps. She has some resources that she and I have discussed, and I think that's going to be the path ahead in terms of us shoring up the achievement values.
Final question is, how are parents or guardians brought into the fold? And the reason why I asked you that question, one, because of that various differences between those 3 groups, but also for reinforcement. And I heard Mark, say earlier that parents, they have, going back to Jay Starzan, some skin in the game. So how do we keep them involved in this discussion, especially as we talk about AP courses? There's some parents, who really don't know what an AP course is, but how do we, educate them to let them know why this is a very important piece for students?
Absolutely. I mean, I could talk about at the school level in terms of what the principals do or try to do, but I think the best example, short example that I would give would be the parent outreach subcommittee of our equity and diversity committee that I expect you're going to hear a lot about when we give the equity and excellence report, which is slated. Is that June 1 or June 5th? Our Equity and Diversity Council has 5 subcommittees, and there's one specific to parent engagement. Since the beginning of the EDC, Rosina has had several parent and community members that have had interest and are serving on the council itself. And I know that, I don't want to steal her thunder for the next report, but I know that there have been questions like, hey, how can we get this on our PTOs? How do we, so there is a lot of, it's created a stir with the parents, a lot of interest and a lot of buzz. And I think that's one of the best vehicles for us to kind of talk about district level initiatives and district level work and pieces that they're doing. I know that I've had outreach from several parents through that venue talking to me about curriculum, talking to me about resources that could be more diverse, and so we want to be able to voice sort of those same things. Well, let's talk about, as your child ages, college and career readiness, the importance of the opportunities that we have.
Thank you, guys. I love this. This is good stuff here. The budget's on our minds, of course, and I'm curious if you can name some programs for us that we're doing now that help address some of these issues and concerns that we've seen. You mentioned REACH, for example. I can think of ASK that we had as something came up last year as a great program. Are there some other things that we can keep in mind as we're considering budget and programs that we want to keep to help address the concerns? And I'm putting you on the spot.
Can I say all of them?
Oh, yeah,
I mean,
yeah. It's so much, right?
This report's so comprehensive.
Right.
I mean, I would ask you to narrow me to a topic. You mentioned REACH, so what jumped to mind was I think I'm going to think about the things that I know we need to improve on. So, the on track for graduation value is something that's come up as something that we have a little bit of a concern about. I'm not afraid of it. I think we've got a lot of pieces that are in place. But REACH is a program that's well aligned to that, because students that are not on track for graduation will likely find themselves potentially in need for that alternative high school setting. Our school counselor ratios and the changes that we've recently made to name 2 ninth grade counselors that do programming specific to that transition year, who should have their eyes out to help those students that are falling through the crack. That's the whole point of that statistic in the PPR, is to identify kids early on that are falling through the cracks, so that you're not kind of worrying about it at the finish line and having to have the uncomfortable conversation that Tom talked about.
I'd also talk about Gretchen. I mean,
Please.
Because we talk about special education spending as being such a big driver, and we don't talk about the programs we have in West Hartford that save a huge amount of spending we would do, like Strive, but go ahead.
So we have Strive as an alternate high school program, and again, the numbers there have been fairly steady over the years, but those students are achieving and they're graduating, and many of them are graduating with that within that four-year goal. But also the school refusal program that you all voted for this year in the budget is going to specifically target the chronic absenteeism and truancy. I mean, we were able to categorize the number of students, really moving from chronic absenteeism to actual school refusal because the numbers were so high. That's also tied right into our homebound tutoring and the number of students that are only with us a partial day, and with another program, a more intensive program, say at IOL for a half a day. So we're hoping to address all of those factors and keep students in the district, in their community, their neighborhood schools, and ultimately reduce the cost. Because, at the end of the day, we just want them engaged in school. And so we're doing quite a bit of work around that. But our special ed programs throughout the schools, pre-K, ELC, all the way through post-secondary, we're constantly looking at how can we do this better? How can we meet the needs of students? We underwent kind of a program review of our elementary program schools this year. We're doing some restructuring in some of those, again, to give more targeted interventions for students with disabilities. These are all things that are just ongoing, in terms of looking at our data, looking at our numbers, and looking at our potential positive impact.
and I think non-programmatic but true impact, math became a named area of focus. We discussed it at the table at board direction, so Paul and myself can say, listen, this isn't a choice. We're looking at what we do. This is a board mandated area of focus, and we have begun to see over those past 2 years improvement. We're good kind of in English language arts, but that showed an increase kind of in previous years after the addition of reading specialists. I mean, that significantly had an impact on our scores. It was just more than a few years ago. So those are the kind of, those targeted things also that aren't necessarily programmatic, but that show the power of making a statement. I think that the pressure from the board that's welcomed about historically about making our staff look more like our students, that's something we should be focusing on, and we have, and we've seen some gains from it.
Thanks. Paul, actually, you gave a great example about the number of school counselors. Now, when I'm thinking budget-wise, and we talk about let's make cuts that don't affect the classroom directly, and this is a great example of, counselors are not directly in the classroom, but they're needed to get people to this graduation rate. Please keep reminding us of that if we forget. It's the definition of what we do, I understand. I'm also curious, and I'm going to quote Ronald Reagan here, trust but verify, right? I often hear that we're looking pretty good as far as our administration versus other districts. And as I look at this table on page 2, I'm thinking maybe I can, just verify that for myself, but it's kind of useless right here because it just tells me the number of teachers we have and the number of people in the central office. But if I were to do a ratio, do some math, and see it per pupil, would that be a fair comparison then if I were to do this for a nearby school district and us?
I'm not going to pretend to be expert in it, but my educated guess is, based on our system, I think we're fairly unique. A lot of districts have a department head model, which is a teacher on stipend, similar to what we have for curriculum specialists at elementary school. So there's no evaluation. They're not 092 certified. They don't hire. They don't fire. They don't evaluate. We have a different model. We're not unique in that. So I think that might make us a little top heavy.
It actually doesn't because of elementary assistant principals.
Oh,
so there's the
trade-off.
There's the trade-off there.
Oh, right.
I don't know. I don't have that number. I know, and you and I talked about the org chart, and it sent Chip on more of a research, and our numbers have certainly dropped over the past few years in that area.
And they have, and that was surprising for me. Talk about that in a moment, just so everyone's aware. But so it can't really be an apples to apples because we may have different systems, or different models, I should say. But what I had found was I found the org chart from 2008, and I just thought I could compare that with the org chart from 2018, and I expect to see a lot of growth in administration. But what we learned was that that's not apples to apples, because you can put anybody in an org chart, and the superintendent 10 years ago may have listed some positions that Tom wouldn't list today, and vice versa. And so Chip was kind enough to put together a nice comparison for us, and we could see that there wasn't that big of a change. Let's see. And I found myself page 5, college readiness table. Another thing, Tom, you've mentioned, we used to be number 1 in spending in the state. Now we're 119. But the expectations of the parents are still as high as they were when we were number 1. And that's where I am when I look at this college readiness table and say, we're West Hartford. This is not our number. But again, we have to look at our expectations versus the money that we have available. I certainly hope that we're not making cuts that are causing this number to be what it is. And I want to keep that in mind as I'm voting for different budget cuts as well. And I think that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
It goes back to the creation of the benchmark. I just want to remind people, 520, I'm sorry, not 5, 485.30 are the benchmarks for English and math. It is a high benchmark that the College Board created. It wasn't based on how many kids will be able to pass it. It was based on what does it take to get 80 or better in your first year college course. So it's actually, our numbers, our college benchmark numbers are actually good comparatively if you break us down and compare us like versus like, town versus town, our numbers are very, very strong there.
Other questions? Okay, because we haven't actually, thank you very much. Because we haven't changed school start times yet, can I just propose that we switch the order briefly and let you guys speak next, so that you can actually go to sleep and turn off those blue lights and stuff like that? Is that okay with everybody?
So first off, congratulations to the Teacher of the Year nominees who are no longer here, but congratulations and enjoy your long night's sleep. Yeah. The Hall community is so excited to have Mr. Zatoun back in school, and the Student Association is organizing a fundraiser for CCMC in honor of Mr. Zatoun's daughter, Abby's brave battle with cancer. This will be held at Lessard Lanes on March 20th and is open to the community to come out and support Abby's Army. We'll be having another meeting before this happens, so I'll give more information then. Congratulations to junior Sarah Lewis for receiving various awards for her poetry. I've been hearing her name on the announcements like many, many, many times. She just has been published in various papers and magazines and contests, and just an amazing writer, so congratulations to her. And last week, many juniors were inducted to the National Honor Society and the National Language Honor Societies for Spanish and Chinese and French, so congratulations to them. The senior class is in their final stretch, and the population not completely plagued by senioritis is preparing for upcoming AP exams, along with many juniors. And getting ready to wrap up, there is a class meeting tomorrow discussing caps and gowns, graduation, prom, and more. And fourth quarter is flying by so fast, and graduation will be here before we know it. The sports teams are doing really great this spring season. Girls golf is undefeated, and boys lax is too. Girls lax is, I think, 9-1. I don't do sports, so I don't know. We're doing really well. And tomorrow is the acting department's painting project, which you might hear about in the Current or something. And it's always amazing to see the juniors bring their selected paintings to life. It's amazing what they do. So if you can see that anywhere, definitely check that out.
So Conard, and it's actually Conard and Hall Unified Theater, is hosting an ice cream social in the Conard Caf on Tuesday, May 3rd from 5 to 8 p.m. AP exams, as Maddie said, start next week, so lots of classes are reviewing and studying very hard. The Conard Drama presents A Midsummer's Night Dream from May 3rd to May 5th at 7 p.m. each night in Conard's Black Box. Admission tickets could be purchased at the door, and it's $10 for adults and $5 for students. And this Friday, elections are being held for the student body to elect their executive board. A president, a vice president, a historian, a secretary, and my favorite position, the Board of Ed representative, will be elected. So I can't wait to see the results. And also congrats to my several peers who Mr. Moore mentioned that won extremely impressive awards at the TSA competition. Thank you.
I could, one thing just to remind people, and you remind me, Grace, May 31st and June 1st is Unified Theater at Conard. It's the largest performance of the year. It's joint Conard and Hall. And I always tell people, if you're picking events to go to, that's the one event I'd go to a year beyond a graduation or anything else. If you want to be uplifted, that's the night. So.
Absolutely. Speaking of being uplifted, congratulations to you and everyone else who now knows where they're going to be next year. It's very exciting. And you can now go to sleep if you'd like. Thank you so much. But for the rest of us, we're down to the boring old routine matters. First, good night. First is the financial report. If I can have a motion that we approve the financial report for the period ending March 31st, 2018.
So moved.
Good.
Report, whoever gets to give it.
So, in the essence of time, this is a good report because there's not a lot to report. So you'll see on page 13, this is our financial, for the general fund, our projected balance, which you'll see is a total of $70,000, and I'll walk you through the next few pages. So on page 14, you'll see there's $40,000 for teacher salaries, a very minor update in consideration. 5116 technical support, $20,000, another minor update. And paraprofessional line item 5117, $10,000, and then 5140 custodian regular is a negative $10,000. Again, another minor update. There's, as you can imagine, there's a lot of variables with 1,500 employees that come and go, and salaries change here and there. So Chip does a fairly good job with this, with these numbers, that they're not that far off and not a lot to report. So if we go to the next page, this is the part where the state, any questions on those two pages? No. The state and federal grant fund reports. There's roughly about $6 million worth of grants, and we get those from both the state and the Fed. A large majority of these grants are 2-year grants. And as you can see, again, really changes prior to the last column is $14,628. But if you really go down to the bottom, it's just under $5,000. Again, really no changes, very little minor updates on that as well. So any questions on that piece? Okay, you know what, actually, I want to go back just so you know, so just to explain, page 14 about the surplus, the 1.265 surplus. That's very typical at this time to have a surplus at this time of year. It's about $500,000 more because of the non-hires from last year. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It's, again, very typical. We always run with this type, but it's up a little from last year because of those hires. All right, and then if we go to the special funds, again, really minor updates. Summer school, we saw a negative $14,000, and then preschool ELC and a $10,000 in investments again, but a net of minus 608. Again, it's not part of the general fund, and it's a very minor update again. Any questions there? So then moving on to our nutritional services. Again, this is almost close to break even. One of the few times this has been, we haven't done this in a while. But it continues to look stable. So that's a plus, and we just haven't been able to report that in a while. So again, very minor updates to the financial report in general. Any questions?
Can I ask a question I've been meaning to ask for months? The fund balance, why does the fund balance actually go up? What money goes into it?
The total general fund?
No, on page 17, the food nutritional services, why do we have a higher balance than the year before? What funds are going into that then come out of it? I thought it was a special fund that was separated out, and we just ended up at zero at some point.
So last year, we ended up with $603,519 is the fund balance, is what we ended up last year. And currently, we're at $600,338. So we've had a net loss of, so there's three components of that. One is the net loss, which is relatively minor, operating loss, $2,047. We also take out of that money equipment purchases, dishwasher breaks, or if the heating tray needs to be fixed or something, or replaced, that type of thing. That's $4,600. And then the other changes are basically interest that we earn on the money. So interest rates, if you haven't noticed, are starting to turn up. So that number will actually start to grow up a little bit. So,
thank you.
Another question on the nutrition page. I noticed the salary line is over $100,000 higher than it was at this point last year.
Benefits. It's all benefits. Salary's actually flat or down because our enrollments, our number of staff is down because the number of meals that we serve is down. So it's all benefits.
Health insurance.
It's all health insurance. They get allocated at health insurance rates based on the allocation rates that are provided to us by Anthem, and they went up. They're going to go up next year again, so.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, all in favor of approving the financial report, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Surprisingly, the ayes have it. In the same spirit of efficiency, can I have a motion to approve the minutes of the April 17th, 2018 board meeting, please?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes once again have it. Okay, reports from other boards or organizations? Did you want to?
Yeah, I was honored to attend the Art Quest presentation last night up in room 400. Take a look, it's on display. Lots of art from our students, and it'll be there for the next month or so. And we also have 2 more Quest fairs coming up, May 9th at Webster Hill and May 23rd at King Philip. If you have a chance, go see what our Quest students have been doing. They worked very hard on that and certainly appreciate your attendance at that. And then Rob and I were fortunate to visit Wolcott School and hear author Alex London talk to the 4th graders. He was there all day, and it was a great experience. I encourage you all, if you have a chance, it was really refreshing for me, and I think Rob, you as well, just to remember exactly what it is we're doing. You can talk about numbers here, but to be there with the kids and the excitement, to learn how he comes up with his ideas for all the books he's written. I learned a few tricks and very interesting stuff. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
If I may piggyback, Tom, after good news you were sharing of different students and things, want to also share at Charter Oak International Academy, the Odyssey of the Mind. Do you want to? Our young people at Charter Oak International Academy, part of the Odyssey of the Mind, won first place in the statewide competition, and they are now on their way to Iowa for the worldwide competition. So certainly want to recognize their good efforts.
That is cool. Please.
So I have a quick, and Tom may be able to chime in on this as well. I attended a meeting this morning at CREC, and it was regarding the future of CREC magnet school funding and how that will impact upon all the 35 BOEs and superintendent of schools. And this really stemmed from the 25 years into the chef decision and how far we've come and what the future of that will look like in terms of the number of seats that are occupied in CREC schools and some of the other decisions that are being faced right now. Apparently, there's a current lawsuit that's on the docket, if you will, I guess, which is the Robinson lawsuit. And so there's some concern about how that will impact CREC and funding and long-term decision-making. So what CREC is doing right now is forming a work group, and from that work group, they'll form smaller subcommittees. So I just want everybody here at this table to know about it, and I'll keep them in the loop as we move forward.
It's very important to pay attention to because it has to do with overall funding with CREC. Now, it would have to be, there's legislative components to this too. They can't just do things unilaterally, and it's a question of how much do you build districts where students are coming from, and there are some districts where an increase in cost would be positively crippling, where they're losing a significant, not West Hartford, any increase is crippling and hurtful, but there are some where the numbers are astronomical. So yeah, myself, other area superintendents have met. We've met with CREC representatives, but it's something that inevitably at some point will be at higher powers besides local boards of ed. But I'm glad you're aware of it, and I'm glad you're keeping everybody informed because it is something to pay attention to.
Tom, is the reimbursement subject by town, or is it even across the board?
It's even across the board as you go through. but it has to do with tuition, raising tuition costs for correct students. How do we pay for the, it's early in the process to talk about it, but some of the solutions suggested are scary because they would affect local boards of education inherently on what is a state-sponsored program.
Are they considering closing any correct schools because of attendance? Because I know they built quite a few, and and just speculation, I don't know any background information, but just I had heard through the grapevine, if you will, that possibly that the attendance is not great and that they built them too many too fast.
There's been some discussion of consolidation. I'm not aware of any firm plans or anything else, but that's certainly been a discussion. Yeah, there is a question of seats that are filled by suburban versus urban students, and empty seats, and but they have a mission. So the mission is to integrate, and so empty seats, who can fill those seats? That's goes back to the Chef lawsuit. So, and actually the governor tried to up the number and routinely place students in that were looking to go in, and the state actually struck that down, the courts.
Right, so it's not lack of interest, it's seats that can't be filled because of certain rules about the seats, criteria about who's, Yeah, it's facing lots of challenges. Other comments, questions, reports, observations? Okay. Future business. Announcement of future meeting dates. Thursday, May 3rd, remember, is the Rethinking School Start Time Parent Night. Please come and share your thoughts. We will be there to listen from 7 to 8:30 p.m. right here in the Town Hall in the auditorium. Tuesday, May 15th is a regular Board of Education meeting. I'll just say right now, I will not be here. I will be in Europe, but we will be ably chaired by the Vice Chair, Carol. It's still at 7 o'clock, still here, right here in the Legislative Chamber. And Tuesday, June 5th, is the regular Board of Education meeting, also at 7, also here. And is that the last board? That's the last board meeting, and that's when we have all our exciting conversations for the end of the year. Request for other future agenda items. Okay. Comments from the many visitors still here? Wake up! That's right. There being no executive session, can I have a motion to adjourn? So moved. Poof. We are adjourned. Thank you all.